tending the grave of her dead child. In 1987, a cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina was brought to prominence when this image was taken by amateur photographer Harry Reynolds. The image appears to show a shawled figure tending the grave of a baby. The appearance is thought to be that of Sue Howard Hardy, who died in 1888, 6 days after her child was stillborn. It is thought she passed away due to complications from the birth. At the time, Kodak examined and tested the photo and the negatives, but could find nothing to explain or disprove what is seen. Roll on to 2022, and a similar apparition was captured in the same cemetery by Casey Alex Lan. This image was taken digitally. Is it Sue Howard Hardy making her presence felt again? What do you think? Lost child or ghost? In 2021, Mitch was driving along the Hume Highway in Bardia, Sydney, Australia, when he spotted what appeared to be a child on the road. His dashcam picked up the image. Take a look. Mitch immediately called the police, fearing for the child's life, and initially they told him not to worry as the child was safe. However, Mitch later found out that the child had not been found, and there were no reports of a missing child, so police called off their search. So was that a child in the video, or was something more paranormal responsible? Who is that? We haven't got a lot of information on this next image, so we'll let you make up your minds as to what it is. First, take a look. Is that a ghost, long exposure, or an unnoticed person walking past? We'd love to know your thoughts. TikTok Mystery Man. TikTok creator Mary Liz 9 caused a bit of a stir when she uploaded this video. Look closely in the background. Did you see that man? The creator claims it was unedited footage, and if so, that is pretty creepy. What are your thoughts? Poltergeist Activity. YouTuber Mellowbird has been documenting videos from his haunted house for years, and we have featured some of his clips before, and they're all pretty terrifying. This is one of his first ones from a few years ago, filmed in his kitchen. Mellowbird believes a destructive spirit resides within his home, and it's not just the kitchen the violent poltergeist activity happens, it's all around his home. There are skeptics who think the whole thing is staged, however the speed and randomness of those flying objects would take some really elaborate timing and props to pull off. If you love poltergeist activity, then you need to check out this channel, as it's well worth a watch. Mysterious moving doll. There is nothing creepier than a haunted doll, and in this next footage caught on a night security camera shows an alleged haunted doll moving on its own. The doll is part of a spooky collection of items Lee and Lindsay Steer have built up over the years that are kept in their Haunted Objects Museum in Rotherham, England. This particular doll was sent to the couple, although they have no history of its background. The footage is even more mysterious because the doll was propped up, and if it was a natural fall, it would have landed on the floor, but it didn't. The way she was positioned seems to defy gravity. What do you think? Alice Springs Spirit. This next image is an old one, but not one we featured before on Top 5s. It was taken in 1959 by Reverend R.S. Blank at Corroboree Rock near Alice Springs, Australia. This photo has been circulating for many years, and our first thoughts were it's just a woman who came into shot unnoticed by the photographer. However, that doesn't explain her translucent dress, and we know this image has been analysed by experts and critics, but still defies explanation to this day. Garage Ghost. This footage was uploaded to Reddit in 2020. It was captured just before midnight on a security camera and appears to show a translucent figure walking across the car bonnet. We all know that these night security cameras can throw up all sorts of anomalies caused by dust, spiderwebs, or insects, but this one is one of the more convincing ones we've seen. What do you think? Sefton Church Anomaly. This picture at Sefton Church in Liverpool, England, clearly shows a man wearing a black uniform, believed to be the old church minister. The photograph was taken in 1999, and no one was visible when the photo was shot. The clothing of the figure is very reminiscent of a holy man, and it does make sense that a former church minister would haunt the church he once preached in. Nessie. Now, this isn't a paranormal one, but a mythical creature one we thought we'd throw in. Nessie is the nickname for the alleged monster that lives in the vast expanse of water in the Scottish Highlands called Loch Ness. Over the years, the monster, believed to be a large marine creature, has been spotted several times, although evidence supporting its existence has been largely discredited. However, in 2022, tourist Steve Shallis took this next photo showing a large creature cruising the water. What do you think? Now, it does have similarities to a catfish, but even so, that is a catfish of monster proportions. Poltergeist caught on camera. We don't have a lot of information on this clip, but we think it speaks for itself, and if it's not a hoax, then it's seriously creepy. Ghost of a former tenant. In 2022, a couple from Minnesota were left spooked after capturing footage on their CCTV that appears to show ghosts roaming about their house at night. The couple, Joey and Amy, believe the figure in their hallway is the restless spirit of a former tenant who died in their home, and they say they ignored warnings when they were told their home was haunted by demonic entities when they first moved in 2 years ago. The pair are convinced it shows a spectral figure of a woman in a nightgown, and after inquiring with the neighbours, they revealed a previous tenant was an elderly lady, died in the house, and was carried out by paramedics in a nightgown. Chupacabra. Another mythical creature here. In 2018, a giant dog-like creature was caught on camera stalking the streets of Santa Fe in Argentina. The mysterious half-human, half-animal creature was said to have savaged both a pit bull and a German shepherd dog who got into a fight with it. Those who commented on the image likened it to a Chupacabra, the legendary creature in the folklore of parts of the Americas. Lurking in an abandoned hospital. This next video was uploaded to Reddit. It was filmed at an abandoned Californian hospital where a security guard kept seeing strange things. He asked someone else to check it out to make sure he wasn't imagining things, so a maintenance worker took a walk down the hospital corridor and filmed this. At first glance, the man didn't see anything, but when he looked over the footage later, he spotted a dark, all-black figure emerging from a doorway toward the end of one of the corridors. The video sparked a huge debate amongst supernatural enthusiasts, with some believing the figure could have been a random person, while others agreed the presence was too dark to be a human. What do you think? Poltergeist or former doctor. Our final clip is a recording from the former home of a retired doctor in Texas who had recently passed away. After his death, his daughter started noticing weird things going on in the house and set up CCTV cameras to see what was going on. This is what they captured. What do you think of that? The haunted attic. Reddit user Digsaw recalled how he moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a 1930s building in Melbourne, Australia. After a couple of months, Diggs came home one day to find a wooden board on the floor broken into 2 pieces. It was at least an inch thick and had been used to cover a hole in the bathroom ceiling, which led to a small attic space. Extremely afraid that someone was up there, Diggs was hoping that the landlord had arranged to have some work done. Diggs emailed photos to the landlord and was asked to call her straight away. She said she wasn't doing any work in the attic and her last 2 tenants had the same problem with the bathroom ceiling. She replaced the board. A month later, as Diggs lay in bed, he was awoken at 4 AM with a horrible feeling. There was a noise from up in the attic of something being dragged. There was definitely something up there. Diggs turned on the light and after plucking up enough courage went into the bathroom. He found the new board there on the floor broken in 2. But there was something else, the sound of children whispering. The same phrase was being repeated over and over again. "It's your turn. It's your turn." Terrified, Diggs turned on every light and watched TV to calm down, but his pet budgie Dexter, who was kept in the kitchen, began squawking. Stressed out, Diggs went outside to sit in the car and chill out until the sun came up. On returning to the apartment, Dexter was missing from his cage. Diggs found him in the toilet bowl, splashing around for dear life. After washing him and drying him, Diggs rang the landlord. "Oh wow," she said, "you heard the whispering too." Diggs stayed in the apartment for over a year and heard the whispering several times. After moving out, the landlord rang to say that the new tenants would really like to speak to Diggs about the freaky things that were happening in the apartment. Number 17, the Room of Terror. Close to the Botanical Gardens in a charming area of Edinburgh, Scotland, was a neat little row of houses. Very early in the 20th century, a couple bought number 17. For some unknown reason, the house had been empty for several years, and the enterprising couple were able to bag themselves a bargain with the hope of turning the attractive property into a boarding house. Once they had moved in, it wasn't long before the couple noticed that there was a strange and unpleasant atmosphere in one of the attic rooms. No one wanted to even enter the chamber, let alone stay there. It always felt as though someone or something was in the room, watching. One young girl who was working as the housekeeper entered the attic only to come running straight back out again, screaming and crying hysterically. She passed out from the shock of the experience, and once she had been revived, no amount of coaxing could persuade her to explain what it was that she had been so terrified by. Not long after, word spread around the city about the goings-on at number 17, or the boarding house, as it became known. Students from Edinburgh University began to dare one another to go and stay there. One of these students was a young man named Andrew Muir. He was highly religious, but also interested in the spiritual side of matters. Andrew approached the owners of the house and offered to spend a night in the attic room in order to carry out a controlled experiment. Rumours about the house had spread throughout Edinburgh, and the owners were losing business as no one wanted to lodge at a haunted house, so they were delighted by Andrew's offer. It meant they could finally put an end to the affair. They gave Andrew a bell, and he was told that if he saw or heard anything unusual, that he should immediately ring the bell. The residents of number 17 bade Andrew good night and good luck before retiring to bed. Andrew was left alone to carry out his vigil in the uninviting attic room. It was during the early hours of the morning that the noise of the bell being frantically rung and a piercing scream of horror ripped through the silence. Everybody jumped from their beds and rushed upstairs to the attic to find out what was causing all of the commotion. The door was flung open to find the body of Andrew laying dead on the floor, the bell at his side. A look of wretched terror was on his face. It would seem that the poor lad had seen something so terrifying that it had literally frightened him to death. The attic room was never used again, and the whole row of houses was demolished some 20 years later. The boy with no eyes. Another Reddit user, named Commendo4, told a tale about his meeting with a spectral boy. When he was about 10, he was awoken in the middle of the night by the opening of his bedroom door. As he lay there, he felt someone sit down on his bed beside him. He thought that it was his mother, as he felt the bed sink down under the person's weight and something touching his leg. But when he opened his eyes, it wasn't his mother, it was a boy, and there were empty black sockets where his eyes should have been. The boy was about Commendo's own age, and he held out his hand, which held a small box. Although he was shocked, Commendo reached out to take it, but the apparition pulled it back. Again, Commendo reached for the box and said, "Give it." Then he blinked, and the boy had gone when he opened his eyes, but the imprint of where he had been seated on the bed still remained. 5 years later, Komodo's girlfriend was at his house so that they could study together. Whilst waiting for her parents to pick her up, she fell asleep. On their arrival, Commendo woke his girlfriend up. She sat up suddenly and opened her eyes. Pointing at the corner of the room, she immediately lay down and went back to sleep. Commendo woke her again and told her what she had done. She explained that she had seen a little boy up on the wall like Spider-Man staring at me with no eyes. Commendo was completely freaked out and told her the story of his meeting with the boy when he was younger. Another 5 years later, Commendo and his girlfriend were still a couple, and they also had a 2-year-old little girl together. They lived at Commendo's parents' house in his old room. His daughter started to wake up at the same time every night and began talking. When Commendo asked who she was talking to, she said it was a nice little boy who was lost and looking for his mummy. The ghostly visitations continued until the family were able to get a house of their own. Spirit creatures. One night during the 1960s, 2 men were travelling back along the A75 road by car to Annan in Scotland one night. It was late and the road was very quiet. About 10 miles out, the driver noticed an old woman waving frantically. She could be seen clearly in the headlights and was standing in the centre of the road. Just as the driver was about to swerve to avoid hitting her and knocking her down, she vanished. The 2 men were then stunned to see several figures emerging from out of the dark and rushing directly towards the car. These figures seemed to be mostly animals of all kinds: dogs, cats, cattle. Some even seemed to be unrecognisable and fantastical. At the centre of this menagerie, there appeared the shape of an old man. His long white hair flowed out behind him as he ran, and his mouth was wide open in a silent scream. The driver swerved right and left across the road, trying to avoid the strange creatures, and realised that none of them were actually touching the car. Was he just imagining it all? Glancing at his passenger, who he could see was equally terrified, made him realise that he was not hallucinating. Suddenly the temperature in the car plummeted, and the driver felt himself losing control of the steering wheel. Something was trying to take over the driving. Despite the cold, both men felt as though they were suffocating. As the passenger wound down his window, from outside the men could hear ominous sounds of cackling and shrieking. The driver stopped the car and it began to rock from side to side quite violently. Unable to stand it any longer, they both opened their car doors and got out. Everything was still. All they could hear was the rustling of the wind through the trees and the gasping of their own panicked breathing. Once they had calmed down and wanting desperately to get home, the 2 men got back in the car. But no sooner had the driver started the engine than the animals returned, swarming the vehicle. Determined to get through them, the driver pressed on despite the strange and scary noises. Getting nearer to home, they were comforted to see the headlights of another vehicle on the road. As they drew nearer though, they realised that the large van wasn't moving and they were going to crash straight into it. The driver pressed down hard on the brakes, but it refused to work. Both men held their breath as they waited for impact, but the van just disappeared into thin air, along with the animals and the old man. Everything was quiet and the road was empty. Exhausted from their ghostly encounter, the 2 men quickly made their way home. The basement. This story was told by Manny from the Canadian podcast No Inner Monologue, which is a great listen.
When he was a young boy, his family didn't have a lot of money, so along with his uncle, they took on extra work to make ends meet. They worked the night shift together, cleaning the Keg Steakhouse restaurant near to the airport in Toronto. Because his parents didn't have anyone to look after him, while they were at work, they often took him with them. The job was quite easy, and it was well paid, but an incident that occurred one night, along with other supernatural occurrences, meant Manny's parents soon quit. Manny, who was about 11 at the time, and his uncle's girlfriend was sitting at a table near the bar. It was very early in the morning, around 3:30 a.m. All of the lights were on, and Manny could hear his father and his uncle talking together in the distance about a recent soccer game. Manny and his uncle's girlfriend were just passing the time with general chit-chat, when, as usually happened, they both fell asleep. Suddenly they were awoken by Manny's uncle. "Quick, wake up," he said. "We need to get to the basement. Your mum needs help moving some stuff. Hurry, it's urgent." The pair quickly got up and went to gather their things. When Manny looked up, his uncle was a good 20 feet away when he shouted back, "You have to hurry, it's urgent." They were both a bit freaked out by how insistent he was being. By now, Manny's uncle had disappeared from view. They walked in the direction that he had gone, so that they could follow him to the basement, but as they turned the corner of the corridor, they bumped into him coming in the opposite direction. He looked absolutely horrified to see them. Manny asked, "What's going on? Where's the emergency?" His uncle replied, "You two. Your dad yelled that you were locked in the basement and he couldn't open up the door. He told me to go to the car and get the crowbar to force it open." "No," Manny said. "You just woke us up and told us to follow you to the basement because Mum needed some help." "That's impossible," said Manny's uncle. "Your dad and I both heard you yelling for help in the basement as we went past." Then Manny's dad arrived, wondering where his brother was with the crowbar. When he saw Manny and his brother's girlfriend, he went mad at them, telling them, "That's not funny, trying to scare us like that." He asked, "How did you get out?" They explained what had happened, and the four of them were standing in the corridor looking puzzled, when Manny's mother came running over. She was upset and said that there was someone trapped inside the basement, and that they needed help to get out. You can imagine the pure terror as everyone realized that there was someone or something trying to split up the family and lure each one of them down into the basement. The family got out of there as quickly as they could, and after a couple more frightening and unexplained incidents, Manny's mum, dad and uncle stopped working at the restaurant. Andrew Mackey's poltergeist. Mackey was a farmer in Kirkwood, Brightshire. What began one winter's night in February 1695 became known as one of the most violent episodes of poltergeist infestation on record, and terrorised both the Mackey family and their Scottish community. The story was documented in detail by the Reverend Andrew Telfair, the local vicar. On a February night, Mackey went to his barn to check on his cattle, as usual, but found all the livestock running around loose. Bewildered, he tied them back up carefully before going to bed. The next night he found them untied once again, but the following morning one of the cows was suspended from the roof of the cattle shed by its rope. Then things began to happen in the Mackey house. A basket of peat for the fire appeared inside the house, upturned and piled up in a heap. It had also been set alight. If the smell of smoke had not awakened the family, there could have been a disaster. In March, the house was showered by a barrage of stones. It started with small pebbles seeming to appear from nowhere and hitting the building, but the stones soon increased both in number and in size. Not only was the house hit, but also the occupants of the family. Inside, kitchen tools, bed covers and furniture moved on their own. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, huddled in a blanket, which scared the life out of the children. When someone was brave enough to pull back the cover, it turned out to be an upturned stool. Outside, the stones became even bigger, and members of the family, along with anyone who came to call, were black and blue with bruising. There was a continual onslaught of banging, knocking and door slamming. In April, 2 ministers prayed with the family, which made things worse. They were beaten by sticks held by invisible hands, and random fires began to break out. Some bones were found on the property and taken away for burial, but the trouble only increased. Prayers went on for 3 days, with more fires spontaneously occurring, and stones crashing through the roof. It was a good 2 weeks later when the family experienced the presence of a large black entity in the barn, which, after terrifying the Mackeys, just seemed to dissipate, and then everything returned to normal. No one ever found out what it was that tormented the Mackey family for 3 horrifying months in 1695. Shadow Man. We'll finish with the story of security guard Raul Arguello. He worked at the Thomas Aldafo Duco soccer stadium in Buenos Aires, Argentina in April of 2018. Someone was repeatedly opening and then slamming the dressing room door, and Raul wanted to catch the culprit in the act. He had already been down there 3 times and found no one there, so on the 4th trip he took his mobile phone with him to record the strange goings on. I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to film it to show people later on, so they believe it when I tell them, because this has never happened to me before. It's terrifying, Raul said. From a distance we can hear the muffled sounds of the door being banged shut. But as Raul goes further down the stairs carrying his flashlight, the noise becomes deafening. Raul, who is obviously scared, picks up a metal bar before edging cautiously nearer the door. He pushes open the door and bursts in, declaring, "See, no one is there." As he spins around the room, we can see a shadowy figure which skitters across the screen before disappearing into the wall. Raul didn't see the Shadow Man at the time, and it wasn't until he watched the video back later that he saw the horrifying presence. Take a look.
La puta que te parió. Concha de la lora. La concha de la lora. Pero como mierda puede ser que no haya nada. Ay. Ya la tercera vez.
Raul was supposedly so upset by the incident that he quit his job and found another security job elsewhere. And I think you'll agree that was probably the best decision.
When one imagines a haunted house, images of large multi-floored Gothic manors spring to mind, complete with scary gargoyles, creaky staircases, and shadowy hallways, where tortured souls and vengeful demons take up their residence. However, much like the notorious structure in Amityville, Long Island, made famous by the novel and film franchise The Amityville Horror, the dwellings of Sally is just like any other house in a small town, which unfortunately has a ghastly history to its name. As with any credible haunted house story, we must first consider where and what we are talking about before we meet and unmask the terrors that lie in wait on the other side of the door. Atchison is a city and county seat of Atchison County, Kansas, in the United States, which runs alongside the nearby Missouri River. The building itself is still standing, despite the countless array of mysterious and supernatural activity that now attracts visitors from far and wide to spend their time and money to try and make sense of what happened nearly 150 years ago. Known as the most haunted house in Kansas, the residence, whose full address is named 508 North 2nd Street, was built in the mid-1800s during a population boom in the community of Atchison. Despite being occupied by various tenants throughout the years, it was during the occupation by a local physician that changed the course of history for the house, the town itself, and to all of those who live within it. There are conflicting stories about how the building was decorated and reconfigured during the time of the medical practitioner's residence. The most popular story goes as follows. Many state that the front of the home had been designed and used as an open office space, complete with pharmaceutical equipment, medical apparatus, and surgical beds, where the doctor was able to conduct his administrative duties, as well as perform examinations on his patients. The upstairs and surrounding areas were for personal use and served as a conventional home for the man and his wife, which seemed to blossom into a convenient work-home life balance. One morning, not long after the physician had settled into his routine at the house, a lady arrived on his doorstep carrying a child. She appeared visibly distressed, overwrought, and in a complete state of frenzy due to the pain that her daughter was experiencing in her abdomen. As the doctor made immediate preparations for a close examination and diagnosis of the girl, he would learn that the troubled child had collapsed earlier that day due to the severe discomfort in her stomach, that she was 6 years of age, and that her name was Sally. After performing a variety of tests, inspections, and analysis on the infant, as well as discussing the status of her health with both Sally and her mother, the physician came to a swift conclusion and diagnosed her with appendicitis.
Not knowing how bad the pain would get if the appendix would burst, or how much more discomfort the poor girl could take, the decision was made to go straight into the surgery theatre. To ensure that the pouch inside the girl's abdomen did not flare up or split, the doctor wasted no time in grabbing his scalpel and began cutting into Sally's stomach. Unfortunately, much to the girl's anguish and mother's terror, he had begun the procedure before the administered anesthesia had taken full effect. It was noted that Sally's screams were not only blood-curdling, but filled with rage and torment, as she trembled with agony on the surgical bed, before suddenly going quiet and appearing to pass out due to the pain. Much to her mother's fear, and to every patient's worst nightmare, her daughter had in fact died right then and there on the mattress, her body lifeless and limp as the blood dripped from her appendix and mouth. The story of what happened to Sally is indeed tragic, and is something that no one ever wishes to hear, see, or read about from any time period or from any walk of life. Though it is not uncommon for surgical procedures to have failed dreadfully in previous years, especially that of the 1800s, what makes Sally's case most disturbing is that she died whilst in the process of being held down and cut open by a strange man with a knife, her last memory that she was being tortured and murdered. No one knows for sure what happened to the mother, nor do we know much more about the aftermath of the medical practice and that of the physician himself in the months and years that followed. What we do know is that time passed, as did the gossip and memories about what happened on that fateful morning at the ordinary house in Atchison. Time heals all wounds, as they say. However, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that the trauma and heartbreak left behind at the residence would be restored. Sally's name would be spoken once more, this time from beyond the grave. A married couple named Tony and Deborah Pickman became the first people to fall victim to the hauntings at the residence after becoming owners of the house more than 30 years ago. During their stay at 508 North 2nd Street, both Tony and Deborah started noticing odd occurrences that they could not explain. These included voices emanating from certain rooms in the home, finger markings smudged in what appeared to be blood, and most worryingly, physical attacks on Tony from an invisible force. Scratches would mysteriously appear on Tony's body, especially on his abdomen and chest area, causing sharp pains and striking fear into the couple as they were unable to comprehend what was happening or able to fight back. Candles would suddenly ignite and burn for hours on end, as well as flowers which appeared to spontaneously combust when the paranormal activity was at its most prominent. It must also be noted that both Deborah and the couple's newborn baby were never targeted by the unseen entity. However, despite this fact, and the fact that there was no activity within the nursery that was designed for their child, Tony and Deborah decided to seek help after becoming increasingly concerned for their safety. Unable to cope with the ever-threatening situation, not to mention the physical ailments and mental strain that such an invisible phantom was seemingly able to impose upon them, the Pickmans consulted a local investigative team known as the Kansas Paranormal Group for answers. Due to the group's knowledge on the history of the house, including that of Sally, the couple would listen with helpless horror about the events that took place all those years ago, and watch as the team conducted their research, displaying their findings to the terrified husband and wife. It was discovered and relayed by the paranormal team that Sally's spirit, certainly that of a little girl, was indeed present within the house, and even more terrifying, that another ghostly figure was apparent. A middle-aged woman who may or may not have been a contact or relation to the deceased child. This leads many to consider and discuss the possibility of an alternative story about what occurred at the house during the time of the physician's medical practice. On an episode of the popular television series A Haunting, which is primarily based on supposed real-life stories about haunted houses and or people, the mystery surrounding Sally's origins is rather different. According to those involved in the making of the episode, the doctor was, as originally detailed, working from his home at the property, tending to his patients and becoming well known within the community. This time, however, it is believed that he was in fact having a secret relationship with an African American lady who worked as a maid within the house. This affair was extremely secretive due to the cultural differences and racial divide that was prominent in Middle America at that time. Such a relationship, though not uncommon, was never broadcast in public and could have jeopardized the doctor's position within the local community. The affair continued until one day the housemaid became pregnant and eventually gave birth to a baby girl, whom she named Sally. The story goes that when the child turned 6, she fell ill with abdominal pains, which resulted in the aforementioned diagnosis of appendicitis. This time, however, the doctor did nothing at all to help her, instead refusing to acknowledge the mother and child's desperate pleas for help, for fear that his mistress and daughter would be identified and revealed to the world. As the girl slowly drifted in and out of consciousness towards her death, her mother, through sheer anguish and desperation, attacked the man whose duty and profession it was to protect and save Sally's life, regardless of the consequence, and yet refused. Unable to overpower the physician, and with her daughter passing away right in front of her eyes, the housemaid fought with him until the very end, where she too met her demise at the negligence and cowardice of the doctor. This alternative storyline ends with the doctor having moved out of the premises to perform his medical practice elsewhere and to run away from his failures and unforgivable behaviour, which resulted in the needless deaths of 2 innocent, vulnerable souls. Though the doctor never paid the ultimate price for his actions and managed to escape without being brought to justice, the ghosts of young Sally and her mother seemingly remained at the house, their anger and distrust of men becoming ever more evident as the years have passed. It is as if the housemaid wishes to stay with her daughter to watch over her in death, whilst attending to the property and fending off anyone she considers a threat to Sally, which Tony Pickman found out all too well. The conclusion being that whatever happened that day left a never-ending grudge against any man who walks through the doors of the house, a house that may in fact contain the remains of the mother and child underneath its structure or within its grounds. For Tony and Deborah, the attacks were becoming too much to bear. Their dog would see things that no one else could see and began to bark uncontrollably at an unseen spectre on a consistent basis. Objects would also fly across the room at speed in the direction of Tony. So in the end, and unsurprisingly, the couple admitted defeat by packing up their belongings and selling the house, hoping that who or whatever remains within its walls ultimately finds peace. Since the couple moved out, the house at North 2nd Street has remained uninhabited and is the subject of countless documentaries, paranormal ghost hunts, and in the age of social media, a backdrop for Halloween selfies. In recent years, one can pay money to stay at the residence during the year, or at night, to fully immerse themselves in the haunted house, which includes the signing of a waiver to absolve the current owners of any responsibility for what may occur, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional trauma. Naturally, media attention on the property and that of the town and its residents has multiplied due to the internet and wannabe ghost hunters who are looking to exploit the story in any way possible. Yet those who either stay or visit the house leave with an awkward, some may say haunted feeling of having been in the presence of Sally and taken aback by the realization of what she must have went through. It is said that video and investigative equipment suddenly crash or stop working, temperatures seem to drop to sub-zero conditions, and trained animals such as rescue dogs refuse point blank to enter certain rooms of the house, especially that of the nursery. Most recently, in October 2021, Andrea Clements from the Atchison Chamber of Commerce stated that I always get a headache when I'm in the house and a scratchy feeling in the back of my throat. Having explored the Sally house alongside Apex Paranormal Events, a paranormal investigative team which is headed up by lead investigator Elijah Bushholtz, it is evident that the place leaves a long-lasting impression. Every time we've come, it's gotten progressively more intense. What we feel, it's more dangerous, Elijah claims. Elijah and his group agreed to go into the house alongside the American news network Newsy, which is situated and headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Not long after both teams arrived and entered the household, strange things began to occur, some of which was caught on camera and documented by the news channel. Within minutes, it appeared that electronics and technical equipment shut down and was unable to reboot. Elijah states during the creepy encounter that on the first floor in the nursery area, Noises such as footsteps and whispers can be heard, as well as toys moving around the room all on their own. Before both teams make their escape from the troubled house, spirit boxes begin to emit sounds which they believe could be that of Sally, or perhaps the cries from her grieving mother. Though skepticism surrounds many supernatural investigative programs such as Most Haunted and Paranormal Witness, the concept of reality TV blended with actual witness testimony has become big business for those of us who wish to tune in. The format of such shows managed to convince Tony and Deborah Pickman to return to Sally House once more during an episode of the popular paranormal series Ghost Adventures, which is shown on the Travel Channel on a regular basis. On the 6th episode of their 10th season, hosts Zach, Aaron, and former member Nick decided to step through the doors of the now infamous dwelling and were accompanied by the former owners in the hope that Sally would reveal herself one more time for the viewers at home. Throughout the episode, various events took place, which certainly give one pause for thought, considering the history of the house, as Tony Pickman once again feels the wrath of the begrudged spirit. When examining a burning sensation on the back of his neck, the former victim of the house finds it to be a swollen welt, when at the exact same moment, a psychic named Anissa, who is also in attendance, becomes lightheaded and almost collapses. In addition, presenter Jay from the Ghost Adventures crew also feels his arm being scratched by an invisible force, which he cannot explain or see. At another moment in the episode, the motion tracking puck device, which allows people to track spirit motion and behaviors, seems to emit certain words that render the team baffled and terrified. When Billy, another member of the team, uses the device to determine if there is a possibility of contact within one of the rooms, the puck responds by alternating the words, "Scratch Satan, pain, kept spirits." This, plus many other strange noises and unexplained occurrences, happen throughout the team's visit to the house, as well as their return to their hotel in Kansas City, where they continue to analyze the data and are frightened by the evidence that was gathered. No matter what one may think of these popular reality shows, they certainly get us talking and shed a light on stories, people and places that are worthy of our own investigation in relation to paranormal or supernatural activity. And so, it is at this point that we take our leave from the Sally House. Whatever happened in that house all those years ago has certainly left its mark on the community and to all those who dare to enter or stay within its walls. The fact that no one has had the courage to live in the property after the story of Tony and Deborah Pickman was portrayed on the news and other media leads one to believe that something definitely resides at the home of the deceased girl. If indeed the building was the scene of a surgical operation gone wrong, or that of a cowardly physician who was only looking out for himself, let us hope that if the young girl known as Sally did in fact perish in that house, that one day she finally finds peace along with her mother. Until then, always remember that it is believed when someone dies in the grip of extreme rage, sorrow or pain, the grudge which remains will affect those who tread upon it. So be careful when discussing Sally or visiting her house. You never know if she will come out to play. Caleb. This next one was sent to us by one of our valued patrons, Caleb. Caleb works for a pest control company as a termite inspector, and most days he and his colleague Paul are required to enter customers' homes, mostly without incident. However, every now and then, weird things happen, and Caleb and Paul, who work separately, often share their experiences throughout the day, communicating through earbuds and messages, and sometimes sending photos if they see something odd. On one occasion, Paul was sent to a house in downtown Mobile, Alabama, and as he walked up to the door, he took a photo and sent it to Caleb. He then asked Caleb, "If you saw what I'm seeing. There's a creepy kid looking at me through the door." Caleb's hands were full, so he didn't look right away, but he heard Paul enter the house and a man greeted him. Paul then asked the customer if anyone else was in the house, which is what they usually ask, so they don't walk in on anyone in the rooms. The man replied, "Nope, just me." He then asked, "You don't have any kids or anything here?" The guy replied, "Nope, just me and my wife live here, and she just left for work." Paul then performed a routine inspection, going into every room, opening every closet, looking behind furniture, going into the attic and crawl space,
Throughout the inspection, Paul was muttering to Caleb through headphones and confirmed that there was no one else there. At this point, Caleb looked at the photo Paul had sent him and was shocked to see those two eyes peering through the glass door. It's worth pointing out that when Paul first got out of his truck prior to taking the photo, that face wasn't there, and he said it ran up to the door as he walked towards it. Can dogs see ghosts? Our subscriber Kerry sent us this next video involving the strange behaviour of her dog Meg. Meg only ever went for walks at night, as she seemed to have a fear of hearing children playing and seeing people walking from place to place. But one night, she refused to go any further than the back doorstep. She just stood there growling and barking in a strange way. Kerry was confused as to why she was doing this, although a lot of strange things seemed to happen at the house, such as opening and shutting of cupboard doors, smells of smoke when no one smoked in the house, and loud bangs against doors as if an unseen force had thrown themselves against it. Kerry always believes the activity may have had something to do with her late Granda Lynch, and Meg was barking towards a corner where he used to sit. Take a look at the video. It's obvious that Meg has seen or heard something that Kerry couldn't see.
Where are you going at? Meg? You okay? Right, I'll let you on.
Now we know that dogs have a bit of a sixth sense. Is it possible Meg had a brush with the spirit world? Or is there a more plausible explanation? Carrie would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Just to point out that the large black thing in the middle of the yard is believed to be a tree. This next true experience was sent to us by a Dega Outlaw, an author and fellow YouTuber who has done work for us in the past. When Adega was 17, he and his friends went fishing one night at Seal Beach, a local harbour in Southern California between Long Beach and Huntington Beach where he grew up. It was late evening when the group left the harbour after catching and cooking fish on the shore. Because Adega was one of two drivers, he spent the next hour taking friends home, but later realised he had left some valuable equipment back on the beach, so he returned with his father to retrieve it. The road to the harbour passed through what was called the Miracle Mile. This stretch of road passed through Seal Beach Marine Base, a military munitions depot. The street had very few streetlights, only about one every 300 metres, and the road had a high speed limit of 50 miles per hour. Dead centre on the stretch of road, and exactly between the two lights, where it was most dark, Adega's headlights caught a woman standing right in the middle of his lane. He had to swerve immediately to avoid hitting her, but she didn't flinch at all. She just stood there crying dreadfully. Adega was the only car on the road, and there was nothing for a half mile either way. Only high fences and marine bunkers on either side of the road. When he turned around to see if he could assist the woman, she had vanished. There was nothing. She had nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, yet she was gone. Adega believed whatever or whoever it was supernatural. Chris Gonzalez. Chris from Victoria, Texas sent in this next story from his childhood. When Chris was around 8 or 9 years old, he was living with his grandmother, but sometimes used to stay at his mum and her partner's apartment, along with his brother and sister, but they soon realised there was something very wrong in the apartment. It had a dark presence that all the siblings felt. One night, Chris was talking to his brother and sister through the different bedrooms they were staying in. As they all got tired and started to settle down to sleep, they suddenly heard the sound of the typewriter in the living room. At first they thought it was their mother, until she shouted out, "Who's typing on the typewriter? It's too late." All three siblings told her that they were in their rooms, to which their mother said, "Oh my gosh, it's happening again." Apparently it was a regular occurrence, even though no one was in the living room. On another occasion, Chris was in the apartment alone, as everyone was outside having a barbecue, and he had just popped in to use the bathroom when he heard dishes clanking in the kitchen. At first he just thought someone was in the kitchen, but when he went to see who it was, no one was there. He went outside to see if anyone had been in there, and no one had, and his mother told him to stay outside. It seems Chris's mother was experiencing similar things and asked to move apartments as it was getting too much, and eventually they moved to an apartment across the road. However, as the family started moving things out, Chris again found himself alone in the apartment and heard the familiar sound of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. He was still a small boy and was terrified, but mustered up the courage to call out, "Who's there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the dishes getting louder and louder. Chris started to walk slowly towards the kitchen, calling out, "Who's there?" As he got closer to the kitchen, the stacking noise slowed, and as he entered the kitchen, it stopped. There was no one there. But there on the draining board was a pile of neatly stacked dishes. Chris ran out to tell his mother, and she told him to stay out of the apartment, and that this was the reason they were moving. Soon after they moved out, another family moved in, before quickly moving out again. This continued for several years, until eventually the apartment was boarded up and left abandoned, trapping inside whatever was terrifying the families. The Black Figure. This next story and image was sent in by Liam. It was taken by his mum Samantha in 2009, when she went on a school trip to Milner Fields, Bingley, West Yorkshire, in the United Kingdom. Samantha took a photo of some of her students and staff, and in the background, there is what appears to be a woman dressed in black, looking towards the group through the trees. Take a look. Samantha is adamant that there was no one else present at the time of the photo. It was only when she returned to school and was going through the pictures with staff that one of them pointed out the figure. It's worth noting that Samantha was suffering from pneumonia that day, and whilst on the trip had felt like something was following them. This had a chilling significance to us after we looked into the background of Milner Field. Milner Field, it seems, is a cursed place, plagued by tragedy and untimely death. It is the former site of a grand mansion built for Mill Baron Sir Titus Salt, and in its day, it even hosted the future King Edward VII and Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. But tragedy struck in 1887 with the untimely death of Sir Titus. The Mill Empire and Milner Field passed to Sir James Roberts, but despite the initial success, the curse of Milner Field struck when 3 of his 4 sons died. They were all under the age of 36. The surviving son Harry was severely injured in the First World War and went on to marry the nurse who cared for him, but she died in the global influenza pandemic while pregnant with their child. Sir James's daughter Alice married a decorated war hero, but in 1919 he shot and killed Alice's alleged lover, Major Miles Seaton. He was found guilty of the crime and sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Over the years that followed, there were several more unusual and premature deaths among the families who subsequently lived at Milner Field, and the house became hard to sell or rent due to its ghoulish reputation. The last person to take on the house was Ernest Gates in 1923, but soon after moving in, his wife died, and then 2 years later, he died of blood poisoning after cutting his foot. The final owner, Arthur Remington Hollins, took up residence in 1925. Less than a year later, his wife Anne died of pneumonia, aged 43, and 3 years after, Arthur died on holiday from irritation of the gallbladder. The house was abandoned by 1930 and never inhabited again. In the 1950s, it was demolished. All that is left today are traces of the mosaic floor and the entrances to the cellars. And of course, possibly the ghosts of its tragic past. Is that what was following Samantha? And did she catch it on camera? What do you think? The Spectral Coach. This particular ghost has been seen in different forms and at different locations throughout the village. One lady was driving home with her husband from babysitting her grandchildren in the nearby village of Bethersden. It was a little foggy and well past midnight when the couple reached the outskirts of the village, a journey that the couple had taken dozens of times before. As they reached the crossroads known as Pluckley Pinnock, they were dazzled by a bright light. Slowing down, they could see a large, well-lit coach was approaching them. They were shocked to realize that the riderless coach was being pulled along by 2 horses and there were no passengers on board. It just passed by the car before it disappeared into the darkness of the night. In November of 1997, another witness claimed that she could hear the distinctive noise of horse hooves on a cobbled street on her car journey home. Sometimes the coach is pulled by one horse, other times two or more, and they are often heard racing down the road in the early hours of the morning. Pluckley, it turns out, was on a main coaching route, making it a perfect target for 18th century highwaymen, which leads us into our next supernatural tale from haunted Pluckley. The Highwayman. According to local legend, a mob killing is often reenacted at Frith Corner, a crossroads in Pluckley, where a hollow oak tree once stood. The unknown highwayman would hide in the woodlands there and jump out at unsuspecting victims as they passed through the area. One night, the highwayman was seen causing trouble out on nearby Hothfield Common and was chased by soldiers on horseback. He rode through Pluckley to escape, and on seeing the tree, he hid himself inside. He hoped that his horse would gallop away, but instead it stayed near the oak tree and gave away his hiding spot. On seeing the horse, the soldiers found the criminal and a violent and bloody fight ensued, resulting in the highwayman being run through by a sword and pinned to the oak tree. In another telling, he was pinned to the tree and had his head cut off. Either way, he died at that very spot, which is now known as Fright Corner because of how often the spectral scene is replayed. Perhaps the highwayman is a candidate for the stone tape theory, an idea that a traumatic event can be flung out into the atmosphere as a form of energy, absorbed like a sort of recording into rocks and other items in the surroundings, and then replayed when certain conditions are just right. A fascinating sighting of the highwayman happened to villager Bob Godden. He had spent a pleasant evening out and then began the short walk home. After turning a corner, he came across the tall figure of a man wearing black riding boots and a dark cloak. Bob watched as the figure walked slowly across the road in front of him before disappearing into the hedge on the opposite side. Alarmed by his experience, Bob ran the rest of the way home to his wife. Once there, a terrified Bob told her the story, claiming that he was certain that he'd just seen the ghost of the highwayman. Alvey Farm. Numerous spirits are said to reside here, one being the ghost of a Victorian tenant who shot himself in the 1850s after his wife left him. In the 1970s, the owners saw the phantom of a young man in their bedroom many times. The 15th century farmhouse has 3 daring windows and is now run as a boutique bed and breakfast. Apparently the barn is said to be a very scary place to visit. If we were to visit Pluckley, this is the place we'd stay. The Monk and the Lady. Greystones is a large house built by the Derrings in 1863. Before 1924, it was called Rectory Cottage. A reclusive cleric is said to haunt the grounds of the house where he once lived. Known locally as the Monk, he was seen in 1989 by an American journalist who glimpsed a brown-robed figure at the back of the house. Rose Court is supposed to have been built by a member of the Derring family to house his mistress. It is thought to date back to Tudor times, although it's not known if there was a building on the site at that time. Like many houses in the area, Rose Court has 3 Derring windows. There is a connection between the female spirit that haunts this house and the Monk of Greystones. The two fell in love and would snatch brief moments together along the little village lanes. Unfortunately, their romance was not to be, and for whatever reason, they were unable to be together. The lady was so distressed that she made a potion from ivy and poisonous berries, which she drank with the intention of suicide. The monk is said to have died from a broken heart after her passing, and the lady died whilst looking out across the fields towards Greystones to her beloved monk. She has been seen walking in the gardens of Rose Court, and there have been reports of poltergeist activity and the sounds of strange sighs coming from a disembodied voice in the early hours of the morning. The Screaming Ghosts. Derring Woods has been given the nickname Screaming Woods because the cries of the people who have been lost and died there echo around the copse at night. Meanwhile, at the brickworks, the ghostly screams of a man who died after he fell to his untimely death into a pit of clay can still be heard. The Red Lady. Pluckley's parish church is dedicated to St. Nicholas, and this too dates back as far as the 13th century. Here the Derring Chapel was built in 1475, and is separated from the rest of the church by 2 screens. Thought to be the wife of Lord Dering, when she died, quite young, her husband was distraught. In order to preserve her beauty from the devastation of death, her body was clothed in an exquisite white gown, and she held a rose in her hands. Then she was placed inside 7 lead-lined coffins, specially made to fit one inside the other, like Russian dolls. Each coffin was sealed, and then they were placed into an oak sarcophagus. Finally, the lady was laid to rest in the Dering Vault, situated in the south chapel of St. Nicholas Church with other family members. A strange light has been seen dancing around the window near to the vault, and there have been knocking sounds heard coming up from underground. The figure of the Red Lady herself has been seen floating around the churchyard in her beautiful gown in the late evenings, where it's said that she is searching for the body of her stillborn child. The ghost of a lady in a white gown has also been seen inside the church, kneeling down as though praying. During the 1970s, there was another paranormal incident involving the Church of St. Nicholas. With the permission of the then Reverend John Pittock, a group of psychic researchers were allowed to stay inside the church overnight. They had spent the day setting up cameras, thermometers, tape recorders, and other paranormal sensory equipment. They settled down for the night and were locked in. Their hope was to catch a glimpse of the Red Lady. As the night wore on, the group watched and listened intently, but were disappointed when nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Just after sunrise, they heard the turn of the key in the lock and the footsteps of Reverend Pittock as he came up the aisle to greet them. He was struck by how tired and disappointed the investigators looked. When he asked how the vigil had gone, he was surprised to learn that the group hadn't seen a single thing and had no photographs to show for their efforts, and had not recorded any sounds either. They said the fact that the Reverend's little white dog had stayed with them had at least helped to alleviate the boredom. "Really," said the Reverend, "I don't have a dog." The bakery. The renovation of an old fireplace set off a spat of unexplained phenomena at the bakery. Once the original hearth was exposed to the building, disembodied footsteps were heard stomping around in the upstairs rooms, and there are said to be cold spots there, even on the warmest of summer days. The Watercress Lady. Pinnock Bridge passes over a tiny little brook. Just at the turn of the 20th century, an old gypsy lady made her living by gathering watercress down by the banks of the stream. She would sell bunches of it to Pluckley's villagers, who considered her a bit of an eccentric character, but harmless. Every evening at twilight, she would sit on the walls of the bridge and drink gin from her battered old hip flask, while smoking her clay pipe. One night she fell asleep. The pipe dropped down onto the ragged clothing that she wore, and within moments the burning tobacco had set the rags on fire, engulfing her in a flaming fireball. No one was there to hear her tormented screams or help her. She was found the next day a pile of burned ashes. Her buckled old flask and charred pipe were all that was left to identify her. Her ghost has been seen several times over the years, shrieking and screaming in an agony of flames. Lately though, she appears as a faint pink light that hovers above the bridge where the Watercress Lady died. The Schoolmaster. Just past Cliff Cottage, with its 2 daring windows and along Dick Buss's Lane, which was named after a Victorian miller whose property was nearby, is where a group of children got the fright of their lives. It was during the 1920s when they came up the lane on their way to school. They were horrified to see the body of a schoolmaster from the nearby village of Smarden hanging from a tree branch. He didn't leave a note, and no one was ever able to find out the reason for his suicide. Now, when the moon is full, and in the dead of night, the sound of creaking can be heard as a body swings back and forth. Schoolmaster's body is seen swinging from the branch in the place where he took his last anguished breath. The Black Horse Inn. This pub has a long history of haunting. It dates back to the 14th century and was originally a farmhouse with its own moat. It was managed by the bailiff, who was in charge of the entire Dering estate. The timber-framed building has 4 of the Dering windows. Coincidentally, the teacher from nearby Smarden who hanged himself would often meet up with the headmaster of Pluckley School in the Black Horse Inn for a friendly drink. Most of the landlords and their families who have resided here have had some form of interaction with the spooky inhabitants. When Laura Gambling arrived in 1997, the resident poltergeist introduced itself to her almost immediately. Unbeknownst to Laura, the poltergeist had wreaked havoc for previous landlords by damaging heavy wooden furniture and regularly hiding objects. Laura was enjoying a well-earned break on her first Sunday at the pub. It was just before the busy lunchtime rush, and she was sitting at the bar having a cup of tea when she noticed a glass on the shelf above the bar begin to shake. It then slid all the way along the shelf before stopping just at the edge. The entity would remove cutlery from the dresser and rearrange it on the top. Her dogs would become visibly upset when they reached a certain spot in the kitchen and stop there to bark at some unseen force. The dogs would also completely refuse to enter one of the upstairs rooms. In November of the year 2000, two friends who were interested in the paranormal happenings around Pluckley decided to travel to the area and spend a day there. They walked around the village for most of the day, taking in the sights and enjoying the atmosphere. After deciding that they were done for the day, they returned to their car, ready to make the journey home. The car was facing the Black Horse Inn, and as they were about to drive away, they looked up to see the curtain in the top window of the pub begin to move. Curious, they waited to see what might be causing the movement. After a while, they were shocked to see the distinct figure of a young man holding onto the now open window. The boy looked extremely pale, had a dead look in his eyes, and wore an old-fashioned checkered blazer. There were plenty of people milling about the car park, but no one else seemed to be aware of the ghostly figure. The spirit stared directly at the pair in the car, and his gaze never wavered, even as they drove away. The Blacksmith's Arms. This pub was originally a forge dating back to the 16th century. It has had many name changes over the years, and was also used as a tea rooms for a time. A maid has been seen several times standing by the fireplace and dressed in Tudor clothing. She seems to be bent over and turning an unseen spit. Customers have often mistaken her for a real member of staff in some sort of costume. A Cavalier soldier has also been seen wandering around in the rooms upstairs. Those family members who have lived in the pub and have met the ghostly soldier claim he is very friendly and never causes any distress. When the building was taken over by Gloria Atkins, she decided to turn it into a tea rooms. Gloria was invited to a viewing of the property before she made the final decision to buy. Although the pub had been closed for quite a while and a lot of work needed doing for the conversion, Gloria decided to take the building despite the unnerving atmosphere. A date was set for the opening, and Gloria moved in with her family and her assistant Lynn Patterson. No one was aware of any of the paranormal tales that were connected to the former pub. On one occasion, Gloria was sitting at the kitchen table with Lynn. Gloria's daughter, Estella, had taken her baby out for a walk, but she had forgotten to turn off the baby monitor in the nursery. As Gloria and Lynn were chatting, they heard a loud banging noise coming from upstairs through the monitor, followed by the noise of heavy footsteps. Thinking that someone had broken into the property, both of them cautiously made their way upstairs to the baby's room, but there was no one there. On another occasion, Estella was fast asleep in bed one night when she woke up for some unknown reason. Startled, she sat up in bed and was horrified to see the dark, shadowy figure of a young boy. He was aged about 8 years old, and he stood at the bottom of the bed for a short time before his presence faded away into the darkness. Like the dogs at the Blacksmith's Arms, Gloria's dog reacted badly to the pub ghosts. It refused to go upstairs at all and would stand in the same corner spot of the kitchen, constantly barking at something that was invisible to everyone else. When the dog was carried upstairs by Gloria, it would often cower and growl persistently when there was nothing there. Another pub in the village, called the Daring Arms, is said to be haunted. Some say they have seen ghost-like figures in the bar. One witness saw an old lady wearing Victorian clothing. She is thought to be one of the many members of the Daring family that haunts the premises. Of course, ghost stories are often passed verbally from person to person and can become diluted over time. Others have a lot of embellishment added. But with so many tales of the supernatural originating from Pluckley Village, is it really possible that they are all just works of fiction made up from overactive imaginations? Or is Pluckley Village really the most haunted village in Britain and one of the most haunted in the world? What do you think? Between 1989 and 1994, Todd worked on the ramp for Delta Airlines at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. During his time there, he worked on the haunted L1011 aircraft. that used spare parts from Eastern Airlines Flight 401 that crashed on December 29, 1972. Just a bit of background on that crash. Flight 401 was a scheduled flight from JFK, New York to Miami. The crash happened after the cockpit crew were preoccupied with a burnt-out landing gear indicator light and failed to notice that the autopilot had inadvertently been disconnected. As a result, the aircraft gradually lost altitude and crashed into the Florida Everglades. Of the 176 passengers and crew aboard, 101 lost their lives. In the aftermath of the crash, parts of the crashed aircraft were salvaged and refitted into other AL-1011s. In the months and years following the crash, numerous stories began circulating about sightings of dead crew members sitting on board these aircraft. And here we have a first-hand account from Todd, who worked on one of those AL-1011s. Todd's first experience was when he was assigned to load the front bin. AL-1011s are wide-body aircraft with cargo loaded into large pods or cans, which are then placed on can loaders. Todd had just loaded 2 cans in the front bin, locked them down, and waited for some empty cans to be brought around. He was standing near the lower galley, close to an elevator that flight attendants often use to get from the upper gallery to the lower galley before passengers boarded. As usual, Todd noticed a flight attendant and waved to her. She waved back and continued with her work. At first glance, Todd thought she was wearing a Delta uniform that was very similar to the defunct Eastern Airlines uniform. Todd finished loading the cans and locked up the bin, and took the associated paperwork up to the captain. But when he got there, he noticed the first-class flight attendant was not the same woman he saw on the elevator. So he asked her if anyone had been in the lower galley. She said no one had been down there. When he told her what he'd seen, she just smiled and said, "Oh, that's just one of the ghosts. It happens all the time, don't worry about it." After that, Todd saw the same woman multiple times, but was a little more aware, and realized she was in fact wearing the defunct Eastern Airlines uniform. Another experience was when Todd was loading baggage in the bulk bin. The bulk bin on an AL-1011 is at the very rear of the aircraft, and the old belt loaders would have to be at a pretty steep angle and barely reached, so the loaders were a good way off the ground. There was a heavy downpour that day, so it wasn't unusual for ramp personnel and crew to walk under the aircraft to keep dry. However, on this day, Todd saw crew members walking through the rain like it was no big deal, before placing their crew bags on the belt and walking away. Todd grabbed the bags and set them forward to be unloaded first, then prepared to lock up. But just before stepping out, he noticed Eastern Airlines bag tags on the crew bags. It wasn't unusual for old bag tags to be on bags, but as Eastern had been defunct for some time, it was uncommon for a crew bag to have those tags still attached. Realizing this was out of the ordinary, Todd went to the cockpit and asked the captain if there was a deadhead crew, a crew that are officially on duty but not part of the working crew. He said no, so Todd told him about the crew bags. He laughed and said, "That's probably just the ghosts, although this is the first time I've heard about them running around on the ramp." Todd messaged ahead to the destination airport to ask them to look out for the bags, but was informed upon arrival that there were no crew bags in the bulk bin. On another occasion, Todd's shift was 4 AM to noon, and during this particular schedule, the haunted AL-1011 would terminate the night before, and then staff would prepare the plane for a 6 AM departure the next day. Todd remembers catering showing up early, and they needed someone to go up and open the front door, so he ran up and popped the door. As he was leaving, he looked down the aisle and noticed a flight attendant near the aircraft's rear. He knew for a fact the crew hadn't shown up yet, and by this time, he knew all about the ghosts, so it was a little unnerving to actually see and realize that it was probably a ghost. At that moment, the catering lift truck bumped the aircraft, slightly causing Todd to avert his gaze momentarily. When he looked back down the aisle, the flight attendant was only a few feet away. He was so startled that he jumped and stumbled back before quickly exiting the aircraft. The guys on the gate noticed that he was white as a sheet, and one of them said to him, "They're harmless, so get used to them." It was a kind of running joke with the staff, and new maintenance personnel would get spooked when they were asked to work on the haunted AL-1011, and sometimes the cockpit crew would get the new guy to check the avionics down in the hell hole. Not knowing what to expect, the new guys would start their checks and often ask the captain or co-worker, "What's that smell? It's like cologne or aftershave." At which point they would be informed about the flight engineer on 401 who was in the hellhole on impact, and it was his aftershave that was said to linger in that area. Over the years, Todd worked on the AL-1011. He would see multiple things he couldn't explain, such as glimpses of a captain and first officer in Eastern Airlines uniforms, passengers waving to him when he knew the aircraft was empty, although he never smelt the infamous cologne of the flight engineer, despite going in the hellhole to try and experience it. This is a really creepy story, and we'd like to thank you, Todd, for sharing it with us. It's fascinating to hear what you experienced working on the haunted aircraft, and if anyone else has any similar stories, please let us know. The earliest discovered records showing the existence of the Whispers estate are dated back to 1894, so it's believed that this was when the home was built. The building consists of 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a stone basement, and an unfinished space on the 3rd floor. It sits on a 1/4 acre, and the building totals 3,700 square feet. As of 2020, it featured most of the original wooden floors from when it was built, and many of the rooms contain antique furnishings. Between 1899 and 1901, Dr. John and Jessie Gibbons purchased the home from the original owners, the Whites. The Gibbons adopted, abandoned and orphaned children, reportedly because they were unable to have their own biological offspring, so the estate became their family home. The first tragedy hit when 10-year-old girl Rachel started a fire in the front parlour. She apparently wanted a peek at her Christmas presents and snuck out of bed on Christmas morning of 1912. However, she got too close to an open flame, knocked it over, and set her nightgown alight. She was badly burned in the flames and succumbed to her wounds, just 2 days after the incident, passing away at home in her bedroom. Later, the couple's 10-month-old infant, Elizabeth, met her demise in the master bedroom. Her cause of death is unclear, but cot death is presumed. Sometime after this, on May 31st, 1934, Jessie died in the master bedroom following a bout of pneumonia. Adding to the death that plagued the home, John was a popular physician in town and had his office on the ground floor of the house. It has been stated that many of his patients, some of whom were children, passed away in his practice, which he operated out of for around 27 years before he was forced into retirement. 3 years after Jessie's death, there was an insanity inquest initiated against John. It claimed that he was a danger not only to himself but to others. However, just 4 days later, John was cleared of the allegations and he was deemed to not be insane. As a result of all the horror, the manor quickly became inhabited by the undead. There are reports that Rachel can still be seen running around the house, throwing jacks and rolling balls down the hall. Visitors have recalled the faint scent of baby powder and the sound of an infant crying, as if Elizabeth is still in her crib. Guests who stay in the master bedroom have stated that they've awoken to laboured breathing and coughing, while others have mentioned feeling like somebody is sitting on their chest. There have also been instances of items being thrown in the room. Other paranormal activity in the home includes the closet doorknob in the master bedroom jiggling frequently and stopping abruptly, and the closet door banging open of its own accord. Footsteps, some of which sound light and small, and all of which are disembodied, can be heard throughout various parts of the house. The tragedy, however, didn't end with the Gibbons. Over the decades, the manor has spent time as a private residence, and was at one point split up into apartments. There were other deaths in the home during this time. A gentleman in the 1950s or 60s reportedly died in the upstairs bathroom, while a young boy passed away after falling down the stairs. It's believed that the light footsteps heard are the boys' and Rachel's. Reportedly, there are also heavier, more adult-like footsteps that can be heard too. This sound is often associated with violence, including growling, pushing, scratching, and even biting. Guests are warned to be vigilant when they hear these kinds of strides. In 2014, the owner at the time, Van Rayner, told Wave 3 News, "When you hear footsteps, you pray that they are a child's footsteps." They're the little pitter-patter of feet, maybe about 70 to 80 pounds. However, I'm getting tingling just thinking about this. However, there's another set of footsteps that happens in the house. It's more like loud stomping. It is very heavy and menacing. The house became vacant for a few years, but was purchased by a new owner sometime between 2000 and 2004. During renovation work, strange occurrences began to take place, with paranormal activity increasing. The owner would hear knocking sounds, footsteps, and whispers. The manor earned the name Whispers Estate, after visitors reported hearing eerie phantom voices whispering in their ears. Since then, many more stories have come out about the house. There are allegedly 4 graves in the backyard, as well as what psychics call a pit grave, which they claim contains limbs and organs, as well as other horrific human material. Furthermore, there is said to be a portal or vortex which runs through the house from the front parlour to the 3rd floor attic and extends several houses away past the local church. The attic has been labelled the heart of the house, and psychics have stated it reeks of death and rebirth. Those who have tried sleeping in the attic report enduring horrible nightmares and the sound of somebody attempting to break into the room by scratching and jiggling the door handle. Michael Harkness of Orange County Paranormal recalls his visit to the attic, stating, "We was going up to the 3rd floor. There were about 8 or 9 of us, and this was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I could tell something was going to go on, and it was a growl, and we got pushed. There was a presence in there, and we left. We had come out here, and the lady had. We had a dead battery, and one of the lady's tyres was flat, but the house investigators, they got the hell out with us. And that one guy said he's never coming back. Doors were slamming upstairs, and it sounded like people marching." Another infamous entity known to haunt the estate has been dubbed Big Black. This shadowy, mysterious figure is described by psychics as being not of this world. The figure is often encountered in the rooms that were once John's office, but is known to wander around the remainder of the house, unafraid of being spotted. While it's not known to be violent, it is nonetheless terrifying. In one instance of a shadowy figure appearing, although it's unclear if this is Big Black or somebody else, staff member James Evans recalled, "We were waiting for the group that was currently in here to leave. As we looked in, we could just see this ominous shadow, very large, waiting inside the dining room. When we got to the parlour, we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the basement, one by one, very methodical. All the lights were on, nothing obstructing our view. However, slowly it started to get darker and darker, almost as there's a shadow moving towards us. And as it got closer to us, all the sound dropped out of the room. The energy of the room turned electrifying. Slowly this thing rushed towards us. We heard just this giant gust of wind rushing at us. At that point we ran out." Across the years since the house was built, paranormal investigators have shown a keen interest in the manor. EVP sessions have revealed that numerous entities are hanging around the home at any given time, and some have reported hearing John Gibbons whispering in their ears, while sometimes grabbing or groping them, especially women, which makes sense given the sordid rumours surrounding his conduct as a doctor. Ghost hunters often do rounds throughout the house at various times of the night, and have reported, sometimes upon leaving the servants' quarters, just after the last person exits in the room, the heavy door slams forcefully closed behind them. Chris Spedus, an investigator with Heartland Hauntings, remembered hearing footsteps that he described as ominous and unnatural, and disembodied voices that made it difficult to pinpoint where they were coming from. Another investigator with Heartland Hauntings claimed to have seen a girl resembling Rachel on a dining room chair. She had long dark hair and a white dress and sat on the chair as if she was waiting on somebody. When he looked back, however, the girl was gone. Other strange unexplained phenomena that have taken place inside the manor include various drifting scents throughout the home, such as cologne, cigar or tobacco smoke, rancid foods including meat and cabbage, and dirty medical bandages. Guests of the estate have also reported that their cameras have been moved by an unseen presence, forcing the lens away from the intended target, and paranormal tremors can allegedly be felt in one of the house's bathrooms. It has also been said that some beds shake violently whilst being slept in. In one particular report, a group of women who wanted to cheer Rachel up left a doll for her in her former bedroom. However, their gift was not well received. Months later, it was found at the bottom of the stairs, smelling like smoke with some light burn damage to it. The second floor is said to be particularly difficult to tough out, even for the most seasoned paranormal investigator. A staff member recalled experiencing slithering things and scratches and growls. Another, James Evans, also told the story of a woman who wanted to enter a closet alone. She decided she wanted to go in there all by herself. She did not want anybody in there. She did not want a flashlight. She didn't want nothing. Took us 5 minutes and she came crying, busting on the door, wanting out. Something had grabbed her from the top of her spine, and she said it felt like 3 fingers, sharp fingers, cold but hot, moving from the base of her spine down to her lower back. Stacey Van Patten, another staff member, described one incident where she was walking down the stairs and experienced a terrifying bout of paranormal activity. I was coming down these steps and my niece was in front of us, and as we were travelling, we were being very careful because they're very steep. We were hanging on, and literally the next thing I know, somehow, some way, I literally fell, don't know. My face ended up in the hallway where my face almost literally hit the door, and I didn't even touch my niece. Michael Harkness has had his own share of unnerving experiences in the manor. On our first trip, we was up in Rachel's bedroom, and me and 2 of the other investigators was walking down the hallway, and we see a silhouette of a little girl in white coming down at us, and that pretty much made us think, hey, there's something here. But I guess the best thing is that we set up a camera right outside Jesse's door, and we shot the footage outside that door, and you can hear the doorknob turn and see the door. Over the years, the manor has been subject to numerous blog posts, online videos, and even a documentary. It is one of Indiana's most enthralling attractions, and many believe this home to be a prime example of a real-life haunted mansion. Even today, spirits supposedly still roam the hallways, either looking for company or looking to cause trouble. In 2020, the Travel Channel listed the manor as number 4 on their list of the most terrifying places in America. This same year, it went up for sale. It had previously been operating as a bed and breakfast. The selling agent noted that the property was gorgeous and in really good shape for as old as it is. And while it came filled with original antique furniture, the big catch was that it also came with a truckload of spirits attached to it. The property was put up for sale with a price tag of $130,000 and was bought by Richard Ballard, a psychologist with an interest in parapsychology, and in 2022 a new website was created for the manor. If you're brave enough, you can stay overnight at the mansion, but do so at your peril. And if you ever do, please let us know of your experience there. If we ever visit Indiana, we will be sure to stay here. Who's Mackey? Janine from Canada sent this first story in. At the start of 2021, Janine was preparing to move out of her apartment, and her brother had come over to hang out while she packed up the last of her stuff. As Janine sorted through her things, she found an old Ouija board that she had forgotten about and decided to play it with her brother before putting it in the packing boxes. Janine's brother was a skeptic but was curious and agreed to play, although at first he didn't take it very seriously. But after Janine explained to him what to do, they both put their hands on the planchette and said hello. After a few minutes of asking if anyone wanted to talk, the planchette spelt out the name Mackey. At first, Janine thought it was her brother pranking her and told him to be serious. However, moments later, it spelt the same name again. This time, Janine was sure it was her brother joking around, so she stopped the session and decided to play by herself to see if she could make a connection without her brother messing about. To prove to her brother that the board wouldn't just spell out the same name, she decided to tilt her head back and close her eyes, so that there was no way she could peek at the board. Her brother sat on the couch and watched the board. As soon as Ginny asked the starter questions, she felt her hands start to move. No way, her brother said. Soon enough, letter by letter, it spelled out Maggie again. Her brother started recording so Ginny could watch it afterwards, as she couldn't see the board and didn't have enough experience to know where the letters were without looking. Ginny asked if Maggie needed to tell her something or if she used to live in the apartment, but got no further response aside from her name. Ginny spent the rest of the evening Googling any local events that might have her name, but couldn't find anything. To this day, Ginny doesn't know who was talking to her that night and is tempted to pull out that board again to see if the mysterious Maggie makes contact again. If you do, Ginny, we'd love to hear the follow-up story, but be safe. Dark Room Predator. Carrie saw we were looking for Ouija board stories and decided to finally share her story, and we're pleased she did. When Carrie was a teenager, witchcraft and the occult were big things, so she had an interest in all things creepy. One weekend, her parents were away, leaving her and her sister home alone. Her sister, who is 6 years older than her, was an adult and worked shifts, so Carrie often found herself alone in the house. One evening, she decided to make an Ouija board out of paper with a cardboard planchette and lit a candle to try and see if any spirits wanted to make contact, not really believing they would. However, suddenly the board started moving. Carrie was freaked out but continued and eventually made contact with someone claiming to be a teenage girl who died by drowning. Carrie asked the girl for her name, but she just closed down and said goodbye. Deeply troubled by the encounter, Carrie stayed up most of the night. Because it was before the internet was mainstream, she couldn't simply Google and check if anyone had drowned in the area, although she knew there was a lake not far away, so it was plausible. The next morning, Carrie did some tidying, as her parents were due home. As she stood doing the dishes, she could see into the garden and also had a view of the dining room, a room the sisters hadn't entered whilst their parents were away, so the door was kept shut. Suddenly there was a knock, and out of the corner of her eye, Carrie could see the shadow of a male standing in the doorway to the dining room. The door was now open, and although it was daylight, Carrie couldn't see any of the figure's features, but he was definitely a solid person. Carrie froze for a couple of seconds, waiting for the figure to move, terrified it was a burglar. Then she was distracted by the movement of a bird in the garden and momentarily looked away. When she looked back, the apparition had gone. Terrified, Carrie grabbed her keys and left the house and texted her sister telling her what had happened, but was surprised to receive a message from her mum saying, "We heard from your sister, we'll talk about it when we get home." Later that evening, Carrie's mum explained that they had bought the house from a woman and her daughter. The woman's husband and child's stepfather had been a photographer, and she left him after finding provocative pictures he had taken of the daughter in his darkroom. He was later jailed for the crime, and when he was released he committed suicide in woods near the house. To her horror, Carrie was told the darkroom was now her bedroom, and remembered that when they first moved in, under the wallpaper in her room was black paint. Carrie is convinced he was the man who contacted her via the Ouija board, pretending to be a girl, and was the same man she saw in the dining room. Carrie never told her parents about the Ouija board incident, and she never saw the man again. Contacted by Hitler. Lady Fairy was given an Ouija board when she was about 15 or 16, but every time she played it in the house, not much would happen. So one afternoon, she decided to go outside and play, and went through the normal process, although she never asked to speak to anyone specific, and to her surprise, made contact with someone. The conversation progressed nicely, and Lady Fairy asked for the name of the spirit she was talking to. To her horror, the board spelt out Hitler. At this point, Lady Fairy felt a bone-chilling tingling down her spine. She quickly and politely asked to end the conversation, and when the planchette moved to goodbye, she put everything back in the box, put it away, and vowed never to touch the Ouija board again. Dangers of messing with the spirits. When Ryan was about 11 or 12, his stepmom gave him, his brother, and stepsister an Ouija board to play with. Somehow they managed to communicate with a young woman called Tara, who said she was murdered. They asked if she was a good spirit, and she said yes. They also asked questions relating to each other that later came true. For example, they asked when Ryan's father would propose to his stepmom, and Tara told them when, and even accurately described the ring.
Tara even told Ryan and his brother the names of girls they would date. All these things came true. The siblings would also hear knocks on their bedroom door, which would open and close at night while they slept, and they could often sense someone standing at the foot of their beds and hear movement around their room. Things would go missing and turn up in strange locations. All this happened after the Ouija board use. Typically, when they closed their Ouija sessions, they'd say goodbye with a similar response from Tara, but not every single time. Ryan believes that is the reason for the strange things that have plagued them throughout their childhood and beyond. Ryan is now 39 years old and steers completely clear of Ouija boards, and even warns people against using them, believing they are not toys and have sinister undertones. However, in his youth, the Ouija board was not the only brush with the paranormal Ryan experienced. One day, Ryan, his brother, cousin and friend decided to have a go at the terrifying Bloody Mary game, where players tried to summon the ghost of Bloody Mary in a bathroom mirror by continually chanting her name. On this occasion, instead of chanting Bloody Mary, Ryan chanted any ghosts into the mirror whilst his brother stood in front of it. After a while, his brother saw his reflection change into a skull and a fog form behind him, with other black figures lurking in the background who started getting closer and closer until eventually the group flipped the lights on to stop what was happening. Dead hiker. This next one was sent in by Ashley from Canada. When Ashley was a child, she spent the night with her sister at a friend's house. It was the friend's older sister's birthday, so the house was full. Ashley and her friends were too young to play the Ouija board, but her sister and her friends began playing it in the bedroom, while Ashley and some of the other guests stayed in the living room watching a horror movie. Suddenly they began to hear the other girls screaming hysterically, claiming objects were being thrown around, and they could hear things hitting the walls. Shortly after, the girls came out and said to check the newspapers. As they looked through the papers, they found an article about a missing hiker, and Ashley's sister said that was the woman who contacted them, and she had told them to look for her in the newspapers. Soon after, the girls stopped playing an Ouija board as things were getting too weird. The girls went to bed, and Ashley settled down in the living room with some of the others. At around 3 AM, she woke up and found the TV on static. She thought that was odd, but just turned it off and went to the bathroom. However, as she made her way back, she saw one of her sister's friends walking like a zombie towards the bathroom. Ashley shrugged it off, thinking she must have just been half asleep. After the girl went back to bed, Ashley could hear running water. She looked for the source of the noise and found the friend had stuffed the sink with what looked like toilet paper to make it flood. Ashley turned the water off and woke up her friend's father. She didn't tell him who did it because he was scared of getting her in trouble. She spent the next couple of hours mopping up a flooded floor. The following day, the friend woke up with no memory of what she had done, and Ashley didn't tell her. She had since told a few people about the incident, although doesn't think they believe her. However, to Ashley that night was like something out of a horror movie, and she believes it was directly linked to the Ouija board and has vowed never to go near one ever again. Foretelling death. Bernard sent in this story from the Philippines. Bernard and a friend were interested in witchcraft and read a book on the subject about the background of witchcraft and healing spells, as well as the importance of the 4 elements, fire, water, air and earth. They hadn't tried Ouija before, or Spirit of the Glass as it's known as in the Philippines. So when a friend challenged them to a session, they agreed and consulted the book to make sure they did it safely. They created an improvised Ouija board and used salt to create a circle big enough so that 11 participants and a dog could fit in, and prepared a small basin of water and a candle, so the 4 crucial elements were included. At around 12 PM, they turned all the power off and closed all the doors and windows and began the session. Bernard lit the candle and asked everyone to put all of their fingers on a 3.5-inch shot glass that was on top of the board. He told them to follow with their fingers wherever the glass took them. His friend then said, "Tonight I'm opening the gates of the spirits to ours. Communicate with us, O wise ones." To start with, everyone was smiling, not really taking things seriously, when suddenly the glass moved. Some of the group thought it was someone messing around, but then it abruptly stopped, and Bernard's friend announced, "We're connected," and he started to ask questions. "Are you here with us?" The glass moved to yes. "What is your name?" The glass then moved to random letters and numbers. The normal energetic dog had gone really quiet and was fixated on the glass, and a strange coldness engulfed the group. It's worth remembering that the Philippines is a hot place, so this was not normal. By now the group were getting a little freaked out, but they continued and next asked, "Where are you from?" The glass moved to hell. One of the girls started crying, and Bernard reached out to comfort her. Bernard's other friend told her not to be afraid and that they needed to finish the session properly so that nothing bad happened, and Bernard urged the group to wait until the glass stopped moving before stopping. At this point, Bernard noticed in his left peripheral vision a pair of legs that appeared to have pajamas on walking up the stairs. Bernard's friend asked again, "What is your name?" and it moved to E1E. "What is your purpose?" This is when the group moved their fingers from the glass and realized it was moving by itself. The friend panicked and asked everyone to put their fingers back on the glass. They did as he asked, but Bernard started hearing voices that went from loud to quiet, and he felt he had become completely detached from reality. Eventually the game was over, and as soon as the glass stopped moving, everything returned to normal. Out of curiosity, the group tried to move the glass manually, but every time they did, it fell over, and they found it impossible to replicate how smoothly the glass had moved during the session. They soon realized that the board's surface was so rough, the glass couldn't move without getting snagged. The whole thing was deeply unsettling. 6 months after the incident, they mentioned what had happened to the mother of one of the friends, and she told them that she had played with the spirit glass herself with friends, but they had attached a pencil to the glass and let it move on its own. The glass drew a blueprint of a kite, calling itself E7, and chillingly said that one of them would die. They shrugged it off, but later created a kite based on the blueprint. The kite flew so well that in the end, they tied it to a tree because it wouldn't come down. After several days, the kite eventually came back down to Earth, but that wasn't the end of the matter. As predicted, one of those at the session did tragically go on to die of an unknown disease. Was that just a coincidence, or the foretelling of the board? What do you think? To the common traveller, local resident or visitor to East Street in the town of Pontefract, nothing appears out of the ordinary. By most standards, the area is a normal, everyday street, with normal, everyday houses, and situated in the historical metropolitan borough of Wakefield in West Yorkshire. If one wishes to visit the medieval country by car, the area and town of Pontefract is just a few miles southwest of the A1 M62 junction. For those travelling to the region by train from London or Manchester, there are direct connections available, all of which bring you closer and closer to the heart of Yorkshire, and to a curious house on a quiet street. The reason we mention the travelling and visiting options is due to the massive influx of temporary dwellers and guests who come from far and wide to visit and stay in the house that started it all. Pontefract Monkhill Station, on the northern fringes of the town centre, is appropriately named for those who dare to dismount from their normal lives and enter into what has become known as the Poltergeist House, and to the resident that never leaves, the Black Monk. If one decides to venture to the town, and specifically that of 30 East Drive, you will find yourself standing amongst the ancient structures and artifacts that the area has to offer, such as the Church of All Saints, as well as the ruins of the old Cluniac Priory and Castle. As one draws nearer to the haunted house, it must be declared in advance that across the road and upon the hilltop lies the site where once upon a time the dreaded gallows once stood. Dare you enter? Before you do, let us go back to when it all happened, and to the events that made this ordinary house a symbol of evil incarnate. It was the glorious summer of August 1966. Joe and Jean Pritchard had finally managed to secure their long-awaited move to the suburb of Pontefract, and were looking forward to settling into their new home at 30 East Drive. The couple, along with their 2 children, Diane 13 and Philip 15, set about unpacking their essentials alongside Jean's mother, Sarah, who would be staying with them for the time being. It is well known
that West Yorkshire, and the Yorkshire Dales in particular, are a beautiful, scenic set of landscapes in the north of England. And so the fact that the Pritchards were now living in such an area was a lovely feeling indeed. Unfortunately, this feeling of happiness and personal entitlement would be short-lived, almost immediately after they spent the first few nights within their new home. Not much is known about the previous owners or residents within the grounds, but for some reason the house was beginning to form a strong hold over the family as the summer wore on. Joe and Jean were happy that the move was finally complete. Their belongings were set up and the summer holiday to Devon was still going ahead for them all. And yet, despite the possibility of heading to the blue beaches of the English southwest, young Philip decided that he wanted to, or was perhaps compelled to, stay with his grandmother at the house, whilst the remaining members of the family set off on the 5-hour car journey southward. This is when things began to occur that would forever haunt the Pritchards, the house itself, and the town of Pontefract forevermore. Alan Murdy, a barrister by day and paranormal investigator by night, has investigated numerous hauntings on both sides of the Atlantic, including the terrifying case known as the Enfield haunting. A member of the Society for Physical Research and chairman of the Ghost Club, Murdy has also written various accounts and columns on the supernatural. In the case of East Drive, Murdy would document in detail the strange events that befell young Philip and his grandmother in his written pieces when the lights went out. According to the barrister, during those nights of terror both parties felt, cold gusts of wind blowing through the house and shaking doors and windows despite it being warm and sunny outside. Not only would the sudden dip in temperature confuse and chill them to the bone, it is well noted that during the hauntings, a whitish powder would suddenly begin to manifest all by itself, as if from nowhere, within the living room quarters, as well as a set of puddles appearing on the kitchen floor, despite no leaks being found. Murdy also notes that a horrible green froth would overflow from the taps and shoot out at various intervals, leaving the boy and his grandmother in a state of fear and bewilderment. From there, during a single evening, wardrobes would abruptly shake, the house lights would continuously turn on and off without warning, furniture would mysteriously be found overturned, and objects within the home would disappear or move on their own. Witnessing the poltergeist performing its magic firsthand, Sarah grabbed Philip and decided to make a beeline for a nearby house, which belonged to her daughter, Mary Kelly. It's important to note that the testimonies reported and documented on this case are naturally up for debate. However, it would appear that whatever was tormenting Sarah and her grandson that evening had followed them to Mary Kelly's house, as the hauntings didn't stop there. According to the proclamations by those at the time, when Philip decided to enter into his aunt's kitchen for a drink, he would be greeted with another barrage of poltergeist activity. Tea, sugar, and other ingredients were tossed in the air, spread across the walls and flooring, and again the lights were being turned on and off by an unknown entity. Concluding that her family was indeed being preyed upon by some sort of ghostly hellion, Sarah screamed the words "Stop it" as loud as she possibly could, in a last-minute attempt to drive the spirits from her loved ones. As if acknowledging the challenge and sensing the desperation in her voice, the demon responded by creating a loud bang from the nearby hallway within Mary Kelly's home before all went quiet. As the night wore on and the early morning hours chimed on the clock, Sarah, Philip and Mary Kelly hesitantly returned to East Drive to inspect the damage that had been caused by the invisible monster, showing the terrified threesome that it had also returned to the property by shaking a set of drawers violently in one of the bedrooms. Sarah took her grandson to stay with a friend and called the police, as well as a paranormal investigator. Unfortunately, all they could come up with was that the house was indeed emitting strange energies within its walls, and that a poltergeist was very much a possibility, although the malignant spirit ceased its activity and remained hidden for a full 2 years following this event. The family, especially Sarah, knew that things would never be the same again, and that whatever this was never going to leave that house. As dreaded by the family, after 2 long happy-ish years passed, and with the phantom staying out of sight, it returned, this time with a vengeance. Not content with terrifying an aging grandmother and teenage boy, the insidious spectre set its sight on the youngest of the family, Diane. The frightened 13-year-old began to hear loud banging noises every night. Throughout the night, coming from the walls of her bedroom, which grew louder and more threatening as time went on. Not knowing what else to do, trying to fend off the spirit with ignorance and determination only made the hauntings escalate to violent extremes. The horrendous, sickening encounters consisted of the demon physically throwing Diane out of her bed, as well as dragging her by her hair out of the bedroom and down the hallway and stairway. The aggressiveness and physicality of the presence was growing stronger by the day and draining every ounce of the family's strength, emotionally, psychologically, as well as physically. With each night that passed, the entity grew more vicious, and on occasion would briefly reveal itself to the troubled household. Documented testimony by the Pritchards state that when the poltergeist activity was at its worst, members of the family began to see a shadowy figure, which to all intents and purposes appeared fully clothed in a black robe with its face covered by a large hood, much like a monk tunic and cowl. The figure became known as Fred amongst the members of the family, and would come face to face with Joe and Jean on a few occasions, forcing them to attempt a cleansing of the home through an exorcist, vicar, and even the police. After failed attempts to banish Fred, and unable to stay any longer as the figure was continuing to manifest itself in front of their eyes, the family had to admit defeat and decided to move out of the premises. As of today, the Pritchards were the last known residents to live at 30 East Drive. However, the house itself remains accessible and open for people to pay money to stay and attempt the summoning of one of the most vicious spirits ever to roam the earth. So who was Fred, and what could he possibly have wanted by subjecting a young, innocent family to such a horrid ordeal over the course of a few years? Eventually the entity would become nicknamed the Black Monk of Pontefract throughout the town and across the country. Multiple investigations from paranormal experts, historians, and reporters would manage to dig up some historical significance as to the identity of the so-called Man of God. Tom Cunniff, a writer and supernatural specialist, declares that during the reign of Henry VIII, a monk was supposedly hanged at the gallows, which geographically is directly across the street from where 30 East Drive sits. Although no official records exist, the friar had seemingly raped and murdered a young girl, similar to the age that Diane was during her haunting, before meeting his demise at the hands of the infamous king. Cunniff makes the case that whoever the cleric was, the deceased spirit remained in the vicinity of Pontefract and settled in on the grounds of East Drive, where he continues to seek retribution for his execution. Others believe that the depraved apparition is that of Richard II, also known as Richard of Bordeaux, who was King of England from 1377 until he was deposed in 1399. The son of Edward, Prince of Wales, is rumoured to have starved to death whilst imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, which originally stood quite close to the modern-day address, although the manner of his death and possible motives for poltergeist activity are subject to debate. Another theory as to who the monk is and why he roams the house of 30 East Drive was discussed by writer Colin Wilson in his book Poltergeist. When discussing the Black Monk, Wilson takes a different approach when he states that the entity is perhaps one of a number of poltergeists who reside in the building and feed off the negative energies that often erupt in family households, especially those who are feared or tormented. There were occasions when Joe and Philip Pritchard's egos would collide. However, a natural occurrence for a teenage boy and his father to argue or disagree would then be exploited by Fred and result in countless instances of poltergeist activity. And yet, despite the theories, discussions, and speculation regarding East Drive and the ghosts that live within its walls, no one has been able to say for sure who or what it is, or have they? With the house generating cash through the visitors and paranormal investigators looking to spend the night, many have shared their experiences online or via live broadcasts. One of those to present possible evidence of the malevolent creature was Peter Bolton and Rob Hughes from Ghost Inspectors Paranormal Group. The creepy image appears to show a hooded figure, its face in full view, within the reflective surface of a mirror hanging in the residence. The mirror itself is situated at the bottom of the stairs, where most of the paranormal activity seems to occur. Another possible sighting from the mysterious monk came from a team of investigators led by 44-year-old mum of 4, Claire, from the East Drive Paranormal Group, which is based near the haunted house in Pontefract itself. The image is extremely vivid and instantly identifiable as the bottom half of an arm, which is cloaked and appears to be holding a set of rosary beads, common amongst monks and practitioners of the faith. As it's a little distorted, and with no one being present on the staircase at the time, Claire believes that her photograph is the best possible evidence of the entity, which has become a worldwide sensation. Speaking of the events in question, Claire noted how the ghost hunting material and equipment that was being used was especially active at the time of the photograph. She states, "We had seen marbles being thrown, and we kept hearing taps and bangs. The arm you can see in the photo is not a solid form. It looks like mist and is very strange, but you can see the sleeve of a robe hanging down." The stairwell and ground floor hallway continued to spark interest and evoke mysterious energy and activity. Kyle Fowler, 28, was also witness to the strange goings-on at the house in Yorkshire. Having decided to visit the dwelling due to his fascination with the unknown and supernatural, Fowler, alongside a psychic medium named Lillian, her husband and son, started their recordings and took pictures in every room of the household. At one point during the investigation, having arrived in the early evening and conducting a séance around 10 p.m, Kyle decided to head downstairs, where by the looks of the picture presented, a hooded face can be seen behind him as a reflection. It was discussed and declared that this spot in the house projects the most sightings of the Black Monk, and is where Diane Pritchard was dragged towards by the sadistic deviant. Another report came in 2012 when a local neighbour of 30 East Drive asked the current owner of the property, a gentleman named Philip, about the new tenants who had occupied the residence. According to the lady, there was seemingly a lot of noise coming from the house, which was keeping her up at night. Philip, who was emptying the bin store at the time, was taken by surprise at her questioning. He would inform her that he had been unable to find a tenant, and that the house itself had been empty for some time. Video footage is also in abundance when it comes to the famous house. During an evening of paranormal pursuit, Steve Archibald, 36, and his wife Carrie were startled and shocked to capture something on camera that no one has been able to explain with confidence. Self-confessed ghost hunters, the couple who founded Pitch Black Investigations, believe that they have caught the Black Monk in the act of his poltergeist activities, as shown in the video. Accompanied by a small group of thrill seekers, Steve and Carrie heard a loud crash coming from the hallway. When they arrived to investigate, they were greeted by a children's push pram, which was lying at the bottom of the stairs. The video clearly shows the buggy being pushed by an unseen force as it tumbles down towards the camera. Although many have questioned the validity of the clip, considering the favourable angle of the camera and opportunity to scare the group of timid visitors, it was real enough for a few of the members to escape the house and stay at a nearby hotel. What do you make of it? And so, this is where our tour of 30 East Drive ends. For many, the story of this house, its residents, and especially the activity that occurred during those turbulent years, in the late 1960s, is questionable, and always up for debate. Yet it remains a significant paranormal case in the study of the paranormal and supernatural. No one can imagine what the Pritchards went through during their torment at the hands of Fred. No one knows who or what the Black Monk of Pontefract is, and what he wants. What we do know for sure is that something dangerous and malevolent resides in that house, and is hell-bent on torturing those who set foot inside its walls. Could it be that a small house in the middle of a small town in the heart of the United Kingdom is in fact a portal or gateway to something far more sinister and demonic in nature? Would you enter the house of 30 East Drive? Perhaps you'd think twice after watching this video. Friars Bush Graveyard, Belfast, Ireland. It sits right in the centre of Belfast's University Quarter and has been used as a burial site since the 5th century, making it older than the city itself. Although it's only a small cemetery, just 2 acres in size, it more than makes up for that in its amount of supernatural activity. Just to the left as you pass through the gates is what is known colloquially as the Plaguey Pit. where hundreds of people were thrown into a mass grave without ceremony following the cholera and dysentery outbreaks and the Great Famine of the 1840s. The cemetery closed in 1852 because of overcrowding when there was an outbreak of fever in the surrounding area. It was noted that because the grave was so full, only a small amount of earth covered the top, and foul smells and noxious fumes filled the air, possibly causing the spread of disease. Ghosts are often seen around this area, perhaps wandering restlessly because they have not been afforded the dignity of a proper burial. In the early 1800s, the body snatcher George Stewart and his partner Feeney used Friars Bush for their fresh source of bodies. They would travel over to Belfast and then take the ship back to Scotland with their stolen corpses before selling them to the surgeons in Edinburgh for their anatomy studies. They were apprehended in Belfast in possession of a brass syringe for embalming, forceps and a surgeon's knife. The bodies of a woman and child were then recovered from a barrel at the docks. Many gravediggers made grisly discoveries as they recovered the bodies of dead babies at Friars Bush graveyard. Babies that had been thrown over the wall by unmarried women and maidservants in the hopes of getting rid of their illegitimate offspring. The sounds of crying babies are often heard when walking past the cemetery at night. The Friar's Thorn Tree stands within the cemetery and is the site where a monk was hanged because he dared to carry out the rite of Mass, which was banned in Northern Ireland during the 17th century. His ghost can be seen swinging from the branches. Opposite the cemetery entrance is the David Kerr University building, and a tunnel runs beneath the graveyard, connecting it to the Ashby building. The tunnel was once used by students as a shortcut between the two buildings. 3 of those students were discussing whether the haunted tunnel stories were true, when one of them said that it was all a load of rubbish and he would prove it by walking the tunnel at night alone. His friends were waiting to meet him at the other side. Halfway through, and quickly losing his nerve, the student began to panic and became disorientated. He felt the reassuring grip of his friend's hand on either arm as they had walked through the tunnel to meet him and guide him back. As he approached the end of the tunnel, he was shocked to see his 2 friends standing there waiting for him. Now, could it have been a friendly ghost that had helped him find his way through the tunnel? They believe it was. Gwydir Castle, Conwy Valley, North Wales. Gwydir Castle is a fortified medieval manor house on the outskirts of Llanwest, North Wales, and is reputed to be one of the most haunted houses in Wales. The ancient Welsh house is situated in the beautiful Conwy Valley, in the foothills of Snowdonia, and is regarded as one of the finest Tudor houses in Wales, and was formerly the ancestral home of the powerful Wynn family. It's now a privately owned luxury guest house. But do not be fooled by its beauty, because it has a dark past and more than one resident ghost. Paranormal activity has been reported in the house since the 19th century, and all the accounts are consistent in what happens and where it happens. In the north wing, the ghost of a young servant girl is a frequent visitor. Her presence is accompanied by a repulsive smell and a sudden drop in temperature, and to make herself known, she places a ghostly hand on your shoulder. The story behind her restless soul goes back to Sir John Wynne, who seduced one of his serving maids, but when she fell pregnant, he murdered her and buried her body in a wall within the house. When the house was renovated years later, a hollowed out space in the wall was found, in the exact spot where the putrid smell is most potent. Crying children are also another regular occurrence, when there are no children present. The castle also has a ghost dog, who starts appearing after the current owners dug up a dog skeleton in the cellar during renovations. Outside the building, on the now expertly manicured lawns, there have been reports of sightings of a ghostly torchlit procession in the dead of night. And although it is not thought the ghost of Sir John haunts the castle, he is thought to haunt Shallow Falls, a popular tourist attraction nearby. The legend says that Sir John Wynne's spirit was trapped there, to forever be purged, purified and spat on by the waters for the evil deeds committed by him in the days of nature. This belief was backed up recently when ghost hunters from the Dark Arts Paranormal filmed at the waterfall and captured this.
Right, I've just seen something on the camera. What the
What do you make of the footage? Prestbury, Gloucestershire. Prestbury comes as a close second to Pluckley in Kent for the title of most haunted village in England. Its best known ghost is the hooded apparition of a monk known as the Black Abbot, who has made several appearances, mostly at Christmas, Easter, and on All Souls' Day. His spirit always follows the same route that begins inside the church, crosses the churchyard and keeps a straight path through the grounds of the old priory before vanishing into the wall of a cottage on the high street, where he announces his arrival by noisily moving things around in the attic. One of the most convincing photographs of the monk was taken on November 22nd, 1990, by Derek Stafford, who was photographing the floodlit gravestones in the churchyard. At the time, he saw nothing unusual and wasn't looking for ghosts, but when he developed his film, he was surprised to see that a mysterious dark figure had appeared in one of the photographs. The thing about this photograph is, it was taken before digital cameras or photoshopping, although there's always been debate about its authenticity, and sadly Derek is no longer around to confirm or deny it. But the Black Monk is not the only ghost to haunt the village of Prestbury. A spectral horseman on a white stallion has been known to gallop along Shaw Green Lane in the early hours of the morning. He is thought to be the ghost of a messenger who in 1471 was passing through the village en route to Edward IV's camp at Tewkesbury, when he was shot dead by a Lancastrian archer. Over the years, his apparition has reduced somewhat to little more than a dull glow. It is said that in the early 20th century, a skeleton with an arrowhead was dug up in the area, and to this day, locals think it was the horseman. A street known as the Burgage is the oldest in the village, and during the Civil War, parliamentarian soldiers were based there. Every night, they would string a rope across the road as a security measure against royalist forces, trying to get through the village. One night, their little trap caught a royalist dispatch rider heading to Gloucester from Sudley Castle after he galloped straight into it and was captured by the soldiers, who executed him on the spot. It is said since his horrific death, the ghostly hoofbeats of him on his horse can be heard in the dead of night, until they stop abruptly as they near the spot where he hit the rope. Another eerie spot in Prestbury is Sundial Cottage, which is said to be haunted by a young girl who loves to play the spinet. She has been seen on numerous occasions, and her music has been heard by a family during World War II, when they took refuge in the cottage. And lastly, the Plough Inn is one of the village's 3 pubs, but the only one thought to be haunted. For many years it's been plagued by poltergeist activity, with things frequently being moved around by an unseen force. There is also the ghost of an elderly tweed-clad gentleman, who makes occasional appearances in the bar area, but as soon as he is approached, disappears into thin air. We'd love to know if any of you have been to Prestbury and experienced anything strange. Liverpool. Liverpool is the 5th largest city in England and is known for many things, including Liverpool and Everton Football Club, the Beatles, the home of Cunard and White Star Lines, and was the port of registry of RMS Titanic. It is also extremely haunted. Mackenzie's tomb in St Andrew's Church, Rodney Street, is a strange one. It is the final resting place of William Mackenzie, who was a civil engineer who spent much of his career in Liverpool. Mackenzie was also known to be an avid gambler who reportedly made a deal with the devil, that he would exchange his soul for lifelong luck on the gambling tables. And when he died in 1851, he was entombed above ground in a stone pyramid, sat upright with a winning hand of cards, as per his instructions. His aim was to ensure his body was never committed to earth to prevent the devil from staking claim to his soul. His plan would have been perfect, except that he forgot that his soul needed to go somewhere, and although the decision to keep his body above ground kept him from the devil, it also kept him from heaven too. A man in a white cloak and top hat can be seen wandering around Rodney Street late at night. In fact, he is often heard rather than seen, a lost soul with nowhere to go. However, the inscription on Mackenzie's pyramid door indicates that he was buried in the traditional way and is not sat upright in the pyramid, but that hasn't stopped the legend, and the story continues to be told and believed by many to this day. Apart from Mackenzie's tomb, Rodney Street is believed to be the most haunted street in Liverpool, as all sorts of paranormal sightings have been reported over the years. The famous Lantern Jaw is the spirit of a man with a huge square jaw, top hat and a long flowing opera cloak. He is often mistaken for Mackenzie, although Mackenzie is said to be much shorter. On occasion, Lantern Jaw and Mackenzie have been spotted together, seemingly arguing about something. Bloody Acre is another spot thought to be haunted. It's a patch of land located adjacent to Liverpool's oldest church, All Saints. The land is said to be guarded by the Angel of Death, who appears when war is imminent. The residents of the area are so convinced about the angel that Liverpool Council promised them years ago that they would never build on the patch of land, otherwise a terrible curse would fall upon them. There are several cemeteries in Liverpool city centre, and St James on Hope Street is one said to have a resident vampire. Sightings of the beast have been reported since the 1960s, and it's not just a vampire. There are also ghosts, and one in particular makes a regular appearance. In life, he was William Huskisson MP, who was laid to rest in a grand mausoleum in 1830. His spirit is seen regularly leaving his mausoleum and wandering around the graveyard. Another graveyard said to be haunted is St Andrew's Cemetery. It seems several years ago a workman accidentally unearthed some bones, and ever since the ghost of a petite woman with a Regency bonnet and a little girl have been seen walking down the nearby Maryland Street. Speke Hall is also one of the oldest buildings in Liverpool, dating back to the 16th century. The half-timbered house is open to the public, and many visitors have been spooked by the building's resident ghosts. One of the most well-known is the Cavalier. During the hall's renovation in the 1950s, workmen spotted a man grinning at them. He was dressed in Cavalier uniform, and was leaning on a beam. He reportedly picked up a hammer and passed it to one of the workmen, who fell through the hatchway in sheer terror. But that's not the only vivid incident with the Cavalier. In the 1970s, a 13-year-old boy named Charlie William would regularly ride to Speke Hall to talk to a strangely dressed man, whose description matched that of the Cavalier. The man referred to himself as Mr. Popjoy, and taught Charlie sword fencing. Mr. Popjoy later admitted to Charlie that he had been dead for years. The young boy was so afraid, he got on his bike and rode away as fast as he could, and never returned to the hall. Another regular visitor to Liverpool is a soldier who catches the train from Birkenhead Central to James Street Station. He is known to disembark from a disused side of a platform and disappear. In 1990, James Davidson, a local lollipop man, told how he and other passengers had seen the ghost on a train one day and was taken aback by its flat appearance, stating it looked as though it was a cardboard cutout. The Jamaica Inn. This next one is a little different, as the Top 5's team actually visited this place. Now, we didn't really capture enough footage or information, and would like to take a trip back to do a full-blown investigation, including interviewing the owner and doing a late-night ghost hunt. But here is an account of our first visit. Built in 1750 as a coaching inn, the Jamaica Inn in Cornwall in the southwest of England has a long history of smuggling, ghosts, and all things creepy. We took a visit last year as we wanted to see if we could sense anything strange, or even see something for ourselves, not only in the inn, but also the surrounding infamous Bodmin Moors. Previous reports of paranormal activity have included hearing conversations in the hallway in a strange language believed to be Old Cornish, the sound of horses' hooves and the metal rims of wheels turning on the rough cobbles in the courtyard, as well as someone pacing the corridors in the dead of night in heavy boots, as well as the ghost of a stranger who was supposedly killed outside the inn way back in the day by an unknown assailant. Rooms 1 to 12, which are located in the original part of the inn, are said to be the most haunted. We were staying in room 12, situated above the Daphne du Maurier Museum, which back in the day would have been the old stables. First impressions of us touring the inn and our room was nothing sinister. However, something worth mentioning is that in the morning, my wife said that during the night I woke up and said I was going to drink water. She then heard me lift a glass bottle of water off the bedside table and drink. This is strange because A, I never wake up in the night to drink, and B, the only bottle of water in the room was one on her bedside table. So I would have had to reach over her in the pitch black to grab it, then drink it and put it back. Unfortunately, none of this was picked up on the camera as it was too dark, and the sound recorder didn't pick anything up either, so we're not sure what happened. The next morning we headed out to the moors to see if we could sense anything. The moor has a famous tale of the Beast of Bodmin, a supposed phantom wildcat that lives in the area, Although we didn't stay in the area long enough to gather enough evidence of its existence, the moors are a desolate and eerie place. When it comes to equipment malfunctions during the trip, we had one strange event take place. One of the gimbal stabilizers that was fully charged before the trip was drained flat when we took it out at the inn. Now, this has never happened before. We of course cannot say what caused this, but some do say paranormal energy can drain electronics, as this is a common occurrence amongst ghost hunters. Again, it could have just been a coincidence, but it's never happened before. We did catch a photo during a walk around at night, in the Jamaica Inn courtyard, that got us all excited. However, the next morning we set out to try and debunk it, and it turns out it was just a wooden bench. It goes to show how easy you can misidentify objects when you've got ghosts on your mind. Overall, we came away with a sense that the Jamaica Inn and surrounding areas of Bodmin definitely hold a kind of eeriness that cannot be found in any other place in the UK. The amount of history at the inn and the ghost stories adds a level of energy that is undeniably creepy, especially at night. As for haunted, well, we did not experience anything to suggest it is. But as always, we'll leave that one up to you. Poltergeist Activity in Abu Dhabi. This piece of footage was pointed out to us by a viewer. It was filmed by an urban explorer in an empty house in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. We do not have a lot of information on it and cannot verify whether it's genuine or not. But we think that the guy in the footage appears pretty terrified. It seems like the place has been taken over by angry poltergeist activity. Take a look at the footage.
هذا مكان مسلمين. أنتم مش جايبكم هنا. أنا متحسن بذكر الله عز وجل. ولن يضرني إلا بشيء قد كتبه الله لي. بسم الله. بسم الله. بسم الله. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. أعوذ بالله. أعوذ بالله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Creepy or set up? What do you think? The nightclub ghost. This chilling footage was captured on a security camera inside ATIK nightclub in Wrexham, North Wales, in the United Kingdom. At the time, the club was closed, but the manager, who was at home, was alerted to an alarm call at the club. And when he looked back over the security footage, he was shocked at what he discovered. Take a look. We have to agree there's a lot going on there, as well as the stools and signs falling over, hanging decorations above the bar, continue to sway back and forth. There also appears to be orbs shooting across the room. The manager who responded to the call is reported to have said that there were rumours from staff that odd things kept happening in the club when no one was there, but just thought it was one of them pulling a prank. After seeing the footage, he is now convinced something weird is going on, because at the time the footage was caught, the club shut and locked up, and it was only him and his assistant who had the key. After the incident, the venue was considering calling in paranormal experts, although we cannot find any update on what they discovered. What do you make of it? Creepy figure lurking in baby's bedroom. This clip was recorded on CCTV camera in a home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The clip was posted to Reddit, but has since been removed due to some unkind comments. A mum posted it asking for help when her surveillance video showed a mysterious figure peering out of her baby's bedroom. If you look quickly at the footage, you wouldn't notice it, but keep an eye on the door at the back of the room. It looks pretty creepy, and is possibly an intruder, as it appears to look around the door as if to check the coast is clear. At the time the footage was recorded, it was just the mum and her baby in the house, but it definitely looks like someone or something else had joined them. Redditors believe the figure appears to have tentacles, and some suggested it was an intruder carrying a weapon, Many urged the mum to call the police in case it was an intruder. Take a look at these enhanced images. If we are to believe the mum lives alone in the house with the baby, seeing this footage must have really creeped her out, as it has us, and we hope she's gotten to the bottom of it. The pastor and the poltergeist. A police chaplain from Florida, US, kept getting notifications from his home security camera of movement in his living room. When he watched what was causing the alerts, he was shocked at what he saw. Take a look. Pastor Menzel Ford said the mysterious orb was hovering around his living room for hours, although he couldn't physically see it when he went to look. It was only visible on the live feed. Now we know a lot of stuff that is picked up on security cameras can be explained by dust, insects, or cobwebs. However, in this instance, that doesn't seem to be the case, as not only does the orb seem too big for any of those, but it later splits into 3. Take a look. The pastor confirmed it was not a flashlight or passing car, and he is completely baffled by what the orb could be, and a little spooked out. Some have suggested the orb could be demonic in nature, and an exorcism may be needed to expel it, while others believe they may be spiritual and nothing to worry about. Orbs in photographs and videos can almost always be explained. However, when an orb cannot be explained, paranormal enthusiasts believe they represent the soul of a human or animal that has passed, which is travelling around from one place to another. The circular shape they take on makes it easier for them to move around, and is often the first state they appear in before they become a full-bodied apparition. Do you think that is the case with these orbs? And if so, let us know. Maltese soap ghost. This next one was sent in to us by a Maltese viewer. It is quite an old one, but it's not one we have seen before, and at the time it caused a bit of a stir in Malta, with many of the locals believing it is the most convincing ghost video ever captured in their tiny country. The entity made an appearance in 2016 during an episode of the popular Maltese soap opera, Friends and Enemies, when viewers noticed a spooky anomaly that wasn't part of the storyline. In a scene where 2 of the actors were having a serious conversation in a church, in the background a reddish dot of light could be seen moving across the doorway to the church. Take a look. Some viewers were so freaked out they contacted members of the production company to check if the apparition was intentional, who confirmed that the only people on set were the 2 actors and the camera crew, and had no idea what the entity was. The scene was filmed in the Church of All Souls in Haltarshin, Malta, and after researching the church, it seems it is fairly new and was built to replace the far smaller chapel and cemetery that dated back to the 1700s, although we couldn't find any other stories of paranormal activity in the area. Could this have been an elaborate hoax by the production team, or was that the ghost of one of the souls buried in the graveyard in the church grounds? What do you think? Now we have a bonus photograph for you. It's the ghost lady of Kelsey Park. Kelsey Park is a public park in Beckenham in the borough of Bromley, Greater London in the United Kingdom, and was originally part of the Kelsey Manor estate. The mansion that used to be part of the estate dates back to the 1400s, but it was demolished and rebuilt in around 1800 and converted into a rambling Gothic revival house with an added chapel. Over the years it was a convent, a school, as well as being used by the military in World War I, before being demolished in 1921. So it's had its fair share of triumph and tragedy, and it's said that the history behind it remains in the form of a lady ghost that allegedly now haunts the area the manor used to stand on. Today the ground is a public park enjoyed by dog walkers and families, and is a popular place for photography and duck feeding. However, over the years, some extraordinary images have been taken in and around the gardens that appear to show the same apparition of a lady dressed in old-fashioned attire. The first appeared in 2010 and was taken by Paul Reed, who was taking his dog Harry for a walk, when he tried to take a picture of him by the ducks. But Harry was particularly reluctant that day and was cowering back towards him as he took the shot. This was odd behaviour for Harry, but Paul thought nothing of it until he looked back at the photos he had taken, and this one appeared. Then in 2006, a similar image appeared as a reflection in the water, this time taken by Jean Gill, who was in the park feeding the ducks with her grandchildren. The latest image was taken in 2018 by Lordana Pascaro, who believes she also captured the ghost lady of Kelsey Park. What do you think? The last two photographs could definitely be cases of pareidolia, but that first image is particularly creepy. School ghost. Chris is currently a police officer in the United Kingdom, but in his previous job he worked for a private security firm and would occasionally be called out to alarm responses at various locations on the outskirts of London. Most of the call-outs were either hoaxes or due to animals or bugs moving in front of a motion sensor. However, on one particular night, Chris was told by his control room that there was a motion sensor alarm activation at a Hare Krishna primary school. It was a fairly routine call for Chris, except that he hadn't been there before. Chris arrived at roughly 2 AM. It was pitch black and pouring with rain. The school itself was huge, with around 20 classrooms which circled a central courtyard with a large shrine in the centre. Once Chris entered the property and silenced the alarm, he turned the building lights on. When he checked the alarm panel, it showed multiple motion sensor activations, as if someone had been walking around the building. Chris walked through the school and noticed that all the interior doors were wide open. He proceeded to check each room and office, and noticed that there were no footprints or animal prints, which was odd as it had been raining all night and the building was surrounded by muddy fields, and he himself was leaving a trail with his muddy boots. After checking the whole building, he confirmed no one was there and nothing had been disturbed, so he just assumed the school staff had left the interior doors open and something benign had triggered the alarm. Chris reset the alarms and left the premises after making sure all the lights were off, all the doors were closed, and all exterior points of entry were locked and secured. Then at around 3:30 AM, Chris got another call from the control room saying you'll never guess what. Chris instantly knew it was the school again. As he left to deal with the call out, his colleague called and said he would come to the school as he was used to figuring out faults with alarm panels and resetting them. The pair arrived at 4 AM. It was still dark and pouring with rain. The first thing Chris noticed was that all the lights had been turned on again. Chris and his colleague entered the building and silenced the alarm, and once again it was showing multiple motion sensor activations. Looking down the corridor, Chris noticed that all of the interior doors which had previously closed were now open again. Thinking that someone was playing a prank, they decided to look through the CCTV footage. The system was motion activated, so it would only have recorded when motion was detected. As they looked through the footage, Chris could see himself recorded on the previous call out, showing him moving through the property, securing it and leaving. After a few minutes, the recording stopped. The next recording showed all of the doors open with all the lights on. Chris and his colleagues were shocked, but they had a job to do and moved through the school and secured it, this time not just by closing but locking the interior doors. But as they walked through the building, they got a strange feeling as if they were not welcome and that something was watching them. It's worth pointing out that Chris and his colleague were used to checking out creepy abandoned buildings with no problem, but this place felt ominous. The two men did their job and left. A few days later, Chris was speaking with an older man who had been with the company for years and was about to tell him what happened at the school, but as soon as he mentioned the school name, the guy said, "Have you seen the ghost too?" He explained that years ago, when he went there for an alarm call, he saw a black shadow the size of a man floating down one of the corridors. He was so scared that he refused to ever go back there. Comfort after tragedy. This next photograph was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call him X. X and his family suffered a devastating accident in 2021, which resulted in the deaths of both his parents, along with 3 other people. For X's grandmother, it was almost unbearable, as it was the second child she had lost. To help her take her mind off the tragic events, X convinced his grandmother to go with his aunt and her family on a camping trip. During the trip, X's auntie took a picture of his grandmother, sitting in a chair eating. However, when they later looked at the photo, they noticed something strange in the background. To the family, it looks like a couple with arms around each other's shoulders, sitting behind Grandma. And the only explanation they can think of is that it's the spirit of X's parents. Now, we have seen this before after a loved one has died, and it often brings comfort to the bereaved families to think their relatives are still looking out for them after they've passed, and we hope that for X and his family this is the case. Our heart goes out to them. Teshia. Teshia is a subscriber and Patreon, and she sent this next photo to us of her dog in a fancy dress. It's easy to get distracted by how cute the dog is, but if you look in the background, there is something strange going on. Teshia has no idea what that is, as there was nothing on the chair at the time, and finds it hard to believe it could be a glitch in the camera, because it was taken with a brand new Note 20 phone. When Teshia zoomed in on the anomaly, she was even more shocked, as there is a definite face-like image. The photo was taken in Teshia's apartment in Portland, Oregon. The block is super old, and ever since they moved in about a year ago, strange things have happened there. They regularly hear knocks on the closet doors, and numerous other unexplained noises in the living room. Also, the dog barks and acts aggressively at nothing, which is very out of character for her. However, perhaps the creepiest thing happened when Teshia's dad stayed over and slept on the living room couch. The next day, he told her that he saw a woman in the reflection of the TV. She was standing behind him, holding up 5 fingers. Could that same mystery woman have something to do with the anomaly in the photograph? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Creepy stay in the UK. This next spooky story was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call him N. In 2016, N and his family visited the UK from the Middle East to get some passport issues sorted out. Whilst in the UK, they lived in a small house built in the garden of one of their relatives. The house was open plan with 1 big bed, 2 sofas, a makeshift kitchen and 1 bathroom. N never liked being in the house, as it always felt tense, as if there was a presence watching him. A lot of strange things happened whilst they stayed in the house, but one stood out in particular. It was around 10 PM and the family were getting ready to go to bed. Because the place was so small, N and his brother slept on the floor and on the sofas. By around 11:30, everyone was asleep, except N. He couldn't sleep, as something didn't feel right. He tried falling asleep multiple times, but it was no use. After about 20 minutes, N turned his head towards the makeshift kitchen area, and there in a gap between 2 of the cupboards was a person who appeared to be glowing white. It was crouched down with its knees tucked into its chest and was rocking slowly back and forth. N rubbed his eyes in disbelief, thinking he was imagining something, but when he looked again it was still there. At this point he felt a wave of nausea, and suddenly the figure moved and started staring right at him, and its eyes turned from white to red. N was so scared he was shaking and hid under the covers, hoping that whatever it was would go away. As he hid, his mother woke up and started praying very loudly and crying. This woke up N's brothers, and they all got up to see what was going on. When N finally came out from under the blanket, the white figure was gone, but his mother was still shaken with fear and could barely talk. She later put it down to a terrifying nightmare. After the incident, N's grandmother came to stay, and she too experienced a similar terrifying nightmare and a force on her that she had never felt before. N thinks he may have an explanation to why these things happen in the house. Before the small house was built, there was an old shed on the site. It had long been neglected and was hardly used, but strange sounds were often heard coming from inside the shed, and it had the reputation of being haunted. The shed was demolished to make way for the house, and in doing so disturbed whatever was lingering inside the shed. N believes it could be those disgruntled spirits that are responsible for what he and other members of his family have experienced when staying in the house. Who's that creepy face in the window? This next image was sent in by Jen from Pennsylvania. A few years ago, Jen and her friends were hanging out at her house, and Jen's mother took a photograph of them. At the time, they didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Then about a year later, one of Jen's friends was looking at the photo and noticed something peering through the window. Take a look. Jen has told us that there is no way someone could have been standing looking through the window from outside, as it's too far off the ground and she has no idea whose face it is. Understandably, realizing that somebody might be spying on her has completely freaked Jen out. She has always felt something odd about the house, and has often heard people walking up the stairs when there is no one there, and just a general eerie feeling about the place. It's worth noting that the house is located in the coal region of Pennsylvania and is close to where an old coal breaker used to be. The area is well known as a place where Molly Maguires were active. The Molly Maguires were an Irish 19th century secret society known for their activism among Irish American and Irish immigrant coal miners in Pennsylvania, and after a series of violent conflicts, 20 suspected members of the Molly Maguires were convicted of murder and other crimes and were executed by hanging in the late 1800s. Could it be that members of the Molly Maguires still linger in spirit form, and that is who is peering through the window? The Greenbrier Ghost. In October 1896, Alva Zonahista, who was known as Zona, married her sweetheart, Erasmus Stribing Trout Shue, in Greenbrier, West Virginia, after just a few short months of meeting. Shue worked as a blacksmith and was new to the area. This led to opposition to the marriage from Zona's mother, Mary Jane. She didn't want Zona, who was in her early 20s, to marry the much older stranger, and for other unknown reasons, she just didn't like him. In January of 1897, Zona had been a bride for just 3 months when her body was found at the bottom of the stairs by an 11-year-old boy named Andy Jones. He had been sent to the house by Shue and told to ask Zona if she needed anything from the general store. Young Andy ran straight home to tell his mother what he had seen, before continuing on to the blacksmith shop to inform Shue. Shue, who appeared to be in great distress, ran home and summoned the local coroner, Dr. W. Knapp. When he arrived, he found that Shue had carried his wife upstairs. He had stripped and redressed her in her Sunday best, a dress with a high collar and large bow. Zona's face was covered by a veil. Knapp tried to determine the cause of death, but was hindered by Shue, who remained by his wife's head, embracing her upper body and weeping uncontrollably. So after a cursory examination, Knapp announced that Zona had died from an everlasting faint, now known as a heart attack. Zona's body was laid out for burial. Neighbours who came to the wake noticed that Shue was acting very strangely. He had tied a large scarf around Zona's neck, claiming that it had been her favourite, and he wouldn't let anyone near her body. She was taken to her mother's home on Big Sewell Mountain, and buried on the hilltop there in a small cemetery. About a month later, for 4 consecutive nights, Zona's ghost appeared to her mother. She said Shue was abusive, and he had broken her neck in a fit of rage because she had not cooked any meat for supper. The ghost turned her head completely around to demonstrate the damage to her neck. Mary Jane demanded an immediate investigation. Because of Shue's strange behaviour and the untimely circumstances of Zona's death, prosecutor John Preston agreed to have her body exhumed. The autopsy discovered that Zona had a broken neck. There were finger marks on her throat and the windpipe had been crushed. Shue was arrested and charged with murder, and before his trial, investigations found that he had already served time in a penitentiary for horse theft and had previously been married twice. Both wives had died under suspicious circumstances. One was supposed to have fallen from a haystack and broken her neck. The other had a basket of rocks dropped on her head when Shue was on the roof repairing a chimney. Although Shue protested his innocence, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment due to the evidence being purely circumstantial. The people of Greenbrier, unhappy with his sentence, formed a lynching party but failed in their attempt to hang Shue. He was taken to the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville and died there in March of 1900, aged 38. At trial, Mary Jane's testimony concerning the appearance of her daughter's apparition was entered into the record. The Greenbrier ghost is the only known case in the US in which a ghost's testimony helped to convict a murderer. The Mann family. During the autumn of 1991, Alan Mann was 19 years old. He lived with his parents in Lake Wales, Florida. One day he returned home from work after the night shift. He was asleep during the afternoon, but was awoken at 3 p.m. to find a woman standing in the doorway of his room. She turned towards the hallway as though she was leaving. Alan got up and walked over to the door. but by the time he got there, the figure had disappeared. He said he looked all over the house for the woman, but could not find her, and all of the doors of the house were locked from the inside. Alan told his mother, Sandra, that he thought that he might have seen a ghost, but she dismissed the idea. Alan eventually married a girl named Linda, and she moved into the Mann family house. One evening, Sandra was sitting on the couch watching TV with her daughter-in-law, when she saw the ghost herself. Sandra noticed a white, smoke-like form appear at the end of the couch. Her dog, Princess, who was sitting beside her, also noticed it too, but by the time the dog had jumped down, the apparition had disappeared. Although Linda had not seen anything strange, she was positive that the house was haunted. She enlisted the help of a friend who owned an Ouija board, and together with Alan, they performed a séance. They were awarded the name Kramer, although no one knew anyone by that name. Alan's father David was startled by a strange smell in the middle of the hallway and believed that a little voice inside his head spoke to him, saying, "This is Isabella." On one occasion, Alan said that Linda violently attacked him. It was incredibly uncalled for, and she just snapped. Normally, Linda had a high-pitched giggle, but she started laughing in an evil way. Alan tried to push her away, but it only made Linda more vicious. Alan had to physically slam her against the wall before she would let go of him. Then Linda just gently placed her head on his shoulder and carried on the conversation exactly where she had left off before she had snapped. Afterwards, Linda could not remember what had happened and was upset when Alan told her what she had done. Now recognizing the seriousness of the situation, David went to see a spiritualist. He was told to pour salt all around the house, keep bags of it under their beds, and try an exorcism. But none of this worked. Everyone in the family was suffering from violent headaches, and they began to hear many voices all muttering together. One voice was that of a woman, and it was louder than the rest, but they could not distinguish what any of the voices were saying. A local medium visited the home and was able to name the ghost that lived there as Isabella Kramer. It was a familiar name to the Manns, as they had been aware of it for several weeks. A minister visited the family, and afterwards the phenomena appeared to settle down. Regardless, Sandra and David decided to move. But while they were packing, Linda began to shout and swear angrily at the ghost, causing a light bulb to explode and catch fire. The Center for Paranormal Studies from Silver Springs began an investigation into the activity. One of the 3 team members, Andrew Nichols, described the house as having an extremely oppressive atmosphere. The team soon began to experience headaches, and Nichols said that the old bedroom of Alan and Linda had the most amount of activity. Polaroid photographs were taken, and one showed a vague human shape. Sandra believed that the shape in the photo was Isabella. The image was examined in 1993 at Polaroid headquarters, and it was determined that the shape seen was not due to a defect in the camera or the film. The Black Hope Curse. During the early 1980s, Houston, Texas experienced a huge redevelopment program. There were new citizens arriving at the area who wanted to be close to the hustle and bustle of a lively city, but also wanted to live in a quiet, safe area. So housing subdivisions were constructed in the outlying areas. One of these was built just outside of Houston in Crosby and called the Newport Subdivision. It was an appealing and upmarket development. The brand new homes were stunning, with well-mown lawns, and you would think that it was the picture-perfect place for families to live out their American dream. Sam and Judith Hanley believed just that. So when they moved into the western perimeter of the development in 1982, they thought that it was their dream house, the home that they had always been looking for, and at first they were very happy there. The Haynes decided to put a swimming pool in the backyard, and the construction crew arrived to make preparations. It was then that a strange elderly gentleman turned up on their doorstep. He introduced himself as Jasper Norton, and he said the Haynes needed to know something about the backyard before they put in the pool. Sam followed Mr. Norton around the house, and the old man pointed to an area on the ground and said there were graves there. He showed Sam the exact spot where they were, and advised him not to go through with the plan. Sam wasn't sure what to say. He didn't know whether the man was joking around, but was unsure as to why anyone would find it funny. Norton then explained that he had buried the bodies himself when he was in his teens. He said that the area had once been a cemetery, and most of the interned there were former African American slaves, and it was called Black Hope Cemetery. He said the last burial there was in 1939, and there were at least 60 paupers' graves still there. It seems that the housing developers had just built over the top of the cemetery without moving any of the bodies. Wanting to find out if this was true, Sam and Judith began to dig in the place that Mr. Norton had pointed out. It wasn't long before he hit something hard and made of wood. The couple had uncovered 2 coffins containing human remains. One of the skeletons had 2 wedding rings on the index finger. Judith Haynes was horrified that they had desecrated someone's grave. Sam called in the sheriff, and the county coroner performed an official exhumation. With the help of Mr. Norton and some research into local records, the skeletons were found to belong to 2 former freed slaves who had died in the 1930s. They were called Charles and Betty Thomas. The decision was made to rebury the bodies and let them rest in peace. And that is when the paranormal phenomena began, not just for the Haynes, but for dozens of other families in Newport. It began when Judith noticed that her bedside clock had started to spark and glow even though it was unplugged. On another night, Judith was alone in the house when she heard the sliding door open and a voice ask, "What are you doing?" On inspection, she found the door was locked. In the morning, she was unable to find her shoes, and they'd reappear on top of the graves in the backyard. Ben and Jean Williams were the Haynes' neighbour. They noticed that their garden flowers kept dying, and coffin-shaped sinkholes began to appear in the garden. It didn't matter how many times they were filled in, they would suddenly reappear. The house was plagued with cold spots, whispering voices, shadowy figures, and had a general air of dread throughout. Ben actually saw 2 ghosts in the house one night. He watched them walk down the hallway and to the bedroom. He even passed through one of them in an attempt to protect his wife. Both families sought legal action against the developers for failure to disclose that their houses were built on a graveyard. The Williamses moved back to Montana after their daughter was struck down by a mysterious illness and died. The Haynes had to move away after declaring bankruptcy. The judge ruled that the developer was blameless. Many families in Newport have suffered with poltergeist activity and have seen strange apparitions, yet others have never experienced anything strange. Perhaps one thing is clear: it's probably a good idea to move and re-enter any bodies from grave sites before you start building on the land. Big Moose Lake. Grace May Brown was just 20 years old and worked at a textile factory in Cortland, New York, when she met Chester Gillette. The Gillette skirt factory where Grace worked was owned by Chester's uncle. Chester was well known in the area as a womanizer who considered himself a big shot because he came from a wealthy family. Grace was just a factory girl. Nevertheless, she caught Chester's eye. He was rich, handsome, and heir to the Gillette fortune, so Grace was quite easily swept off her feet. Chester refused to take Grace out in public, but she was so happily in love that she didn't care, and in 1906 she became pregnant with Chester's child. He arranged a romantic break to the Adirondack Mountains. They stayed at the Glenmore Hotel on Big Moose Lake on the way there. Chester rented a canoe for a romantic ride out onto the lake. There he hit Grace over the head with a tennis racket and left her to drown when she fell into the water. He fled the scene but was later caught, tried for her murder and sent to the electric chair. It could be that Grace never left Big Moose Lake though. It is said that she has been seen many times since her murder. Further up the lake, at Covewood Lodge, a misty white apparition is often seen around the property. Sometimes a figure is seen falling through the water before vanishing into the murky depths. Other times just a face is seen creepily floating beneath the surface. Wherever the presence is felt, at Big Moose Lake, there appears to be a veil of overwhelming misery and hopelessness that has left some witnesses with a breathless feeling of abject terror. The Tallman family. In April of 1986, Deborah and Alan Tallman moved to the small farming town in Hirocon in Wisconsin. The church-going family had 3 children and were looking forward to living in their dream home on Larrabee Street. In February of 1987, they bought a used bunk bed from a second-hand store. The bunk beds were assembled and then stored away in the basement. The beds had been purchased for the 2 young daughters, and in May they were moved upstairs. The older boy, Danny, was to sleep next door in the smaller room. That night, Debbie tucked him in and left the clock radio on for him as he fell asleep. Danny got up and told Debbie that the station had changed. Debbie got him back to bed and reset the station, but he quickly got up again and was frightened, saying that the station had changed once again and that he had saw the dial move by itself. It later got to the point where Danny would throw a tantrum at bedtime because he was so afraid to sleep in his room. The Tallmans turned to their pastor for help, and he visited the home, saying that he felt evil in the house and believed that there was a demonic presence. He thought that regularly attending church might help the family. The Tallmans were being terrorized. Doors would slam shut on their own, visitors would see red eyes staring at them, and disembodied voices could be heard all around the house. Just before Christmas, Danny was petrified after seeing another vision. Alan was angry and dared the entity to fight with him instead of frightening little children. 3 weeks later, he returned home at 2 a.m. from a late shift at work. When he got out of the car, he could hear a strange howling noise that was growing louder and louder. He heard a voice call to him from out of the howling. Alan walked around the back of the house to see who was there, but finding no one, he returned to the car and found the garage on fire. Scared, he ran inside to call the fire service, dropping his lunchbox on the way. After going back outside, he saw that the fire had gone out and there was no sign of any damage. It was as though it never happened. Alan went back inside where he locked the door behind him, only to have his lunchbox ripped out of his hand when he reached down for it. It was thrown across the room by some unseen force. Because the children were so scared, Alan began to sleep on the floor of his daughter's bedroom. He was awoken one night to find the room engulfed in a strange mist and a voice threatening him, saying "You're dead." Alan was so afraid that Debbie had to call the pastor. He arrived to find Alan with pale skin and blue lips, and he was shaking with fear. In January of 1988, a teenage relative stayed over to help Debbie and the children whilst Alan was at work. Whilst he was helping to get the children ready for bed, he began screaming for Debbie. He and the children were hysterical because they'd all seen an apparition in the bedroom. It was the final straw. They got the kids and fled the house for good. 2 weeks later, the Tallmans had the bunk beds destroyed. They moved to another city where they never experienced any other paranormal activity. A new family moved into the house on Larrabee Street, and they too never experienced any strange phenomena. Scratched by an unseen force. This disturbing story was sent in by Janka from Slovakia. About 5 years ago, when Janka was 20 years old, she was not in a good place. She hated school, had health issues, and was struggling with depression. One summer's evening, Janka was home alone in her parents' apartment as they were away on vacation, and she decided to take a shower. At this point, everything seemed normal. But as she turned on the water and started washing her hair, she felt a sharp pain in her arm. Janka opened her eyes and noticed that the ceiling light was blinking fast. At this point, she felt quite scared and nauseous. Then a horrible feeling of dread came over her, like someone was about to do something bad to her. Janka ran out of the bathroom through the hallway to her bedroom, leaving water all over the floor. As she climbed onto her bed, the light in the bathroom stopped blinking, and the light in her room started blinking uncontrollably. Something had clearly followed her. Janka went into full panic mode and kept repeating, "Wherever you are, please go away. Please leave." After a couple of seconds, which she said felt like an eternity, all the activity stopped. The light went back to normal, and the heavy, awful feeling of despair and fear left her. It was like her reality shifted from nightmare mode back to normal. As Janka collected herself, she noticed something on her arm, a small scratch in the shape of a hook. The shape was strange, not like a regular scratch from a scrape or a cat. Janka has drawn us a recreation of the strange mark. Things got even weirder when the next day she woke up and the scratch was gone. Not a trace of it was visible. The skin had just gone back to normal. Janka shared her experience with friends, and one of them advised her to sprinkle salt in the corners of all rooms. So she did, and it seemed to work, as apart from the one terrifying incident, nothing weird has happened since. Janka has asked us to share her experience in the hope that someone may have had a similar experience, or has knowledge of what it was, as 5 years later she is still shaken from the incident, and would like some closure or explanation as to what happened that day. The eerie face in the limpet. Now this is an odd one. It was sent to us by Eloy. A few years ago, Eloy's mother retired and sold her home and business, and moved to a condo in Toronto, Canada. She loved music, especially Portuguese folk and pop music, and over the years she collected several albums and singles on vinyl. When she was going through her belongings prior to the move, she gave Eloy her entire vinyl collection. He took all the boxes and put them away in his house, and figured he'd look through the collection at some point in the future. A few years later, Eloy was planning a major renovation at his house and had to move a lot of stuff around. That's when he came across the boxes with his mum's vinyl collection. He decided to take a look through the collection, and as well as finding some gems from Elvis and the Beatles, he came across something unusual. It was a single with a cover picture that looked like an oyster shell with a strange face in the centre. Eloy called his mum to see if she knew the story behind it. She told him that the Conjunto de Francisco Jovia were a musical group founded in Toronto, Canada, who immigrated from the Portuguese Azores. Their leader wrote a song called O Misterio de Lapa, or The Mystery of the Limpet, after seeing it in person. The cover picture was not an oyster shell, but rather a limpet shell. Limpets are a popular food in the Portuguese islands. The shell with the face in was found on the island of São Miguel in the late 70s. At the time, its discovery was well publicised, with many believing the image was that of Jesus Christ. The shell was even displayed at the annual feast of Senhor Santo Cristo dos Milagres, or Lord Holy Christ of the Miracles, and Francisco Gouveia apparently attended the festival and was so inspired to write a song about what he saw. In the song, Francisco sings about his feelings towards the face in the limpet, but doesn't provide any insight beyond that. However, Eloy's mum told him who she believes is the face of the limpet. Back in the day, São Miguel was a very religious and superstitious society. She should know, as she was born and raised there until she immigrated to Canada. It was at the time when homosexuality was frowned upon, and most gay men would live their lives in the closet, and many would even get married and have children to comply with societal norms. Such was the case for one man who was having trouble with his marriage, and the fact he was living a lie. Legend states that this particular man was at the end of his tether and decided to take his own life, so he went to one of the main rocky cliffs on the edge of the ocean on the island, stripped off his clothes and folded them neatly on a rock and jumped to his death. After his wife noticed he was missing, the only thing that was found were his clothes, and it's believed that he is the mysterious figure in the limpet. Lingering roadside ghost. This next image was sent in by Anthony and was taken on August 26, 2021 in Fairfax, Virginia, a metropolitan suburb of Washington, D.C. in the United States. Anthony captured the image as he drove home from work. He always passed an abandoned house and one day stopped to take some photographs of it. At first, he didn't notice anything remarkable about the shots he took, but when he looked again at them 3 days later, he noticed a white translucent figure in one of the photos. After doing some research, Anthony discovered the house dates back to the late 19th century, and on the right side of the front door are letters and numbers that read 5400 Goolsby Way. Originally there was a general store next to it called Balvin's Grocery. Anthony also contacted a Facebook group called Abandoned in Virginia, and a group member informed him that his grandfather owned the house and the store next to it, and his grandma was born in the house in 1924. And his family had found a 1931 newspaper article in the walls of the house, although he had no information on any hauntings. Could it be that the former owners of the house from nearly 100 years ago still linger around the property in spirit form? What do you think? Living with the spirit of Mrs. Hammett. Julie and her husband moved into a large old pre-Second World War house on Anzac Day in 1981. It had been empty for 10 years and had nothing done to it since it was first built, and still had all the beautiful original fittings and features. However, the house felt creepy and neglected, with peeling paint and an atmosphere that felt like death. A few nights after they moved in, it was a warm night and the couple were finding it hard to sleep, not helped by the cat sleeping on Julie's chest. At around midnight, there was an almighty bang, like someone was throwing heavy furniture in their living room located just off the main bedroom. They ran out expecting to see burglars or something, but there was nothing. In the panic, the cat had scratched Julie's eye, and she had blood pouring down her face, which only added to the terror. Looking down, they noticed that the cat was now arching and spitting at something in the corner of the room, and her gaze was fixed on something they could not see. She growled and hissed like they'd never seen before. After a full search of the house, they found nothing, so shrugged it off, did the necessary first aid, and went back to bed. A week or so later, Julie was home alone doing some cooking when something walked up behind her, casting a shadow on the white kitchen cupboards. The shadow was moving, but Julie was not. She looked around expecting to see her husband home from work, but there was no one there. Julie checked outside thinking that someone was near the window, but there was nothing. Over the course of the next few weeks, this happened often and was becoming a regular occurrence, although Julie's husband did not believe her and thought she was losing the plot. However, strange things continued to happen, from appliances unplugging themselves, things going missing, shadows, and also balls of stale perfume moving around the house. They knew it was the perfume worn by the old lady that used to own the house, as her belongings were left in the back bedroom, along with her old perfume bottles. Even after the room was renovated, walls painted, carpet and curtains replaced, the smell still roamed the house. The couple had 2 children, a boy and a girl, while one night their daughter came out crying, saying she wanted her dolls taken out as one of them kept on waving at her. Julie knew exactly what was causing it: Mrs. Hammett, the previous owner. Julie had done some research with the neighbours to find out more about her and her life, as she was now a very firm believer in the afterlife and wanted to know more about her. Perhaps the scariest incident was when the family was sitting in their living room one night. The dishes were done and everything was cleaned and the kitchen and dining room lights were off. When Julie noticed the glow of the kitchen light, she got up and turned it off and went back to watch TV again. A few minutes later, the light was on again. Thinking it was one of the kids, she checked on them, but both were sound asleep. Turning the light off again, Julie returned to the lounge. It happened again, so she turned the light off and stood there, in front of it, to see what was happening. It switched itself on again, right in front of her eyes. Julie freaked out completely, wanting to bundle the kids up and never come back. The house had been fully rewired by an electrical engineer a few years earlier, so she rang him, telling him what was happening. He had no explanation and said it's not possible. After that, things settled down with no occurrences at all. Julie now feels bad about how she reacted, thinking she had scared Mrs. Hammett out of her own house. However, just a few years later, Julie saw an actual apparition. It was the top half of an old lady walking in to what used to be her bedroom. Strangely, Julie felt no fear, just relief that she was still there. Dudley Castle Drummer Boy. In August 2021, Ryan and Natalie went on a family day trip to Dudley Zoo and Castle in the West Midlands, UK. It was an enjoyable day walking around the zoo, but the real draw was visiting the castle grounds, as Ryan and Natalie are both avid believers in all aspects of the paranormal, and the castle is reputed to be haunted by a grey lady. After entering the castle grounds, the couple started to take the obligatory family tourist snaps, but they also took other random snaps in the hopes of capturing something. When the couple got home and looked through their photos, it wasn't the lady in grey they captured, it was the less well-known ghost of the drummer boy. Take a look. They believe they captured a full-body apparition of the drummer boy ghost standing in the courtyard outside a doorway. This is a lesser-known ghost of the castle, but there are a few stories of him. Natalie has ancestral links to the castle, as her 13th and 14th great-grandfathers both owned it. So perhaps with the family link the boy appeared. Natalie and Ryan were part of a large group of 10 people, and none of the group remembers anyone coming out of the doorway after them, and all the children with them were accounted for and stood by them. Since Ryan sent us the photo, the sighting has caught the attention of the local newspaper, and although some have dismissed it as either a black metal cutout, part of the fence, or even a small child, you can see from this photo there is nothing like that where the apparition was captured. It's not the first time the drummer boy has been spotted at Dudley Castle. He is thought to be one of 3 ghosts that haunt the building, with the Grey Lady, believed to be the spirit of Dorothy Beaumont, being the most famous, followed by the ghost of Lord Somery, who has been spotted in the chapel Undercroft, next to what is believed to have been his coffin. The drummer boy is less well known and is said to have been killed in the castle grounds by a single musket bullet. And he can still be heard banging his drum at night. He is also considered to be a bad luck omen. So what do you think? Have Ryan and Natalie actually captured a ghost on camera? We'd all love to hear your thoughts. Gary Gilmore. On July 19, 1976, career criminal Gary Gilmore robbed a gas station attendant, Max Jensen, at gunpoint in Orem, Utah. And despite Jensen complying with his demands, Gary shot him in the head twice and killed him. The next day, Gilmore robbed motel manager Ben Bushnell, who he also shot and killed. Shortly after the deaths, Gary was arrested after his cousin notified the police, and he was charged with murder. He later confessed to both killings, but was only convicted of killing Bushnell due to lack of evidence. Gary was sentenced to death for the crime, and he opted to be shot by firing squad. He refused to appeal his death sentence, and even fired his attorney, who tried to get the sentence overturned. When his mother tried to stop the execution, he wrote to the local newspaper asking her to stop any appeals. Despite being a very intelligent, artistic man with an IQ of 133, Gary spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. He had a chaotic upbringing and a troubled relationship with his alcoholic father, Frank. But was that the reason he turned to crime, or was his life already mapped out for him before he was born by his mother, and her terrifying experience with an Ouija board? Gary's mother, Bessie, was a somewhat unstable character and was convinced her husband, Frank, was the illegitimate son of Houdini. Bessie also believed that all the problems her and her family had encountered throughout their life was the result of a demonic spirit that had attached itself to her when she messed with an Ouija board as a child. This belief was exacerbated when one of her sisters was killed and another one left paralyzed after an accident. When Bessie married Frank and the couple had children, they lived with Frank's mother, Faye, who was a medium. One evening, after Faye had performed a seance, she was particularly fatigued, and Bessie helped her to bed before going to bed herself. Later that night, Bessie woke up to a feeling of being touched and saw a demon face leering at her in the darkness. Shocked by what she saw, she called out to Faye, who started staggering towards her, telling her to get out and shouting it knows who you are. Bessie rushed through the house to rescue her 4 children and discovered the same demon standing over her son Gary, looking at him directly in his eyes. After the incident, Gary began to have terrible nightmares, and when he started getting in trouble at the age of 14, Bessie was convinced that that night the demon she had summoned as a child had possessed her son, turning him into an angry and violent man, to which he became. When Gary was executed by firing squad in 1977, Bessie was quoted as saying that the one who committed the crime was not her son, but was the demon that dwelt inside him. In an interesting side note, Gary's last words before his execution were, "Let's do it," which earned him fame when advertising executive Dan Whedon credited his parting words as the inspiration for Nike's tagline. He is also the subject of Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song, which was adapted into a movie starring Tommy Lee Jones. The Durham Dog Murder. On Christmas Eve of 2014, Paul Carroll from County Durham in the UK used an Ouija board to try and contact the dead, but instead he believed he summoned an evil spirit that possessed his dog Molly. So in an act of complete insanity, he drowned poor Molly in a bath full of water. Paul later tried to bury her body near the Hat and Feather Inn near Concert, but after fearing he would be disturbed, he cut her up and put the bits down the drain at the back of his house. Several days later, the drain became blocked and began to overflow, and emergency drainage men were called to unblock the drain, but they were unaware of the horror that had caused the blockage. However, a neighbour alerted the police after she went round to Paul's house and noticed the dog was missing. When she asked where it was, initially Paul told her it had been rehomed, before later admitting he had killed the dog. When the police arrived on January 10th, Paul told officers the dog had been possessed by an evil spirit, following a seance with an Ouija board. After the confession, the police moved quickly to remove 3 other dogs and a snake from the property. In court, Paul admitted he had killed Molly and was given an 18-week sentence, a supervised order, fined £165, and banned from keeping animals for 10 years. However, that was not the end of the story. Just 1 week after Paul's guilty plea, his wife Margaret and her daughter Katrina used the same Ouija board. This time the board told them they were going to die. The following day, both mother and daughter took an overdose of prescription drugs and set the house on fire. Thankfully, they both survived the fire, but were jailed for 4 years each for arson. Despite their claims, the Ouija board made them do it. The Ouija board made me do it. In 2012, 3 teenage friends from Weslaco, Texas were playing with an Ouija board in a wooded area near a local high school. At some point, for no apparent reason, one of the boys turned to one of his friends and stabbed him in the stomach with a 4-inch blade. Then, in a moment of realization and possibly remorse, he picked his injured friend up and carried him to a nearby auto shop to seek help, and a witness claimed he was urging the victim to pretend that he had fallen on the knife. The injured boy luckily survived the near-fatal wound that caused intestinal laceration and a 3-day stay in intensive care. Officers arrived at the scene quickly and arrested the unnamed boy. And when police asked him why he stabbed his longtime friend, he said the Ouija board made me. At the time, police spokesman J.P. Rodriguez said he actually believed what the Ouija board advised him. The boy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. At his trial, the boy tried to plead insanity, but it emerged that he had no history of mental illness, although he did believe that the board allegedly told him that his friend was the cause of all his problems, and that he should kill him. However, the fact that the boy realized what he had done and was lucid enough to seek help and urge his friends to cover up his crime suggested he was perfectly sane when he stabbed his friend. It was a bizarre case, and eventually the boy was sentenced to 3 years at a Texas juvenile justice facility, and it's very likely he is now free. Clotilde Marchand. This next case proves that an Ouija board is not a modern phenomenon. On March 6, 1930, Clotilde Marchand, a French artist, was found dead at the foot of the stairs in her Buffalo, New York home by her young son. It quickly became apparent she hadn't fallen but had been beaten to death. Clotilde was married to Henry Marchand, a French artist and renowned sculptor who studied under Auguste Rodin and was a specialist in dioramas and precision wax modeling. The couple had emigrated to the US in the 1920s with their children. Throughout their marriage, Henry had been a serial philanderer who had many affairs. Soon after the murder, suspicion initially fell on Henry, but after interviewing him, it became apparent that a young Seneca woman named Lilla Jimison was a more likely suspect. Jimison was one of Henry's models, whom he was having an affair with. Jimison was arrested, and after questioning, she named an older Seneca woman called Nancy Bowen. Further questioning revealed that Lilla had convinced Bowen that Mrs. Marchand was a white witch who used her powers to kill Bowen's recently deceased husband Charlie. The conclusion was apparently made by the two women when they played on a Ouija board to find an explanation for Charlie's death. Allegedly, the board revealed a message from Charlie spelling out "They killed me." When the women asked the board who did it, the board spelled out Clotilde. It also revealed her address. Soon after the seance, Nancy started receiving letters signed Mrs. Dooley that claimed Clotilde Marchand was a witch who had hexed Charlie out of jealousy. But when that didn't work, she decided to kill him. Nancy, who was a vulnerable woman, became convinced that Clotilde killed her husband and she would be next. On the day of the murder, Bowen went to the Marchands' home and knocked on the door. When Clotilde opened it, Nancy accused her of being a witch and pulled out a hammer, then mercilessly beat her before finishing her off by stuffing a chloroform-soaked paper down her throat. Both Nancy and Lilla were charged with murder, but remarkably, Lilla was acquitted after she claimed she was not party to the murder and implicated Henry, saying he was bored of his wife. Nancy was also released after pleading guilty to manslaughter and accepting a sentence of time served. By this time, Henry had moved to Albany and married his dead wife's 18-year-old niece. He was never prosecuted and died in 1951. Lilla Jimison married a local man and lived a long life in Perrysburg, near her old reservation. She died in 1972. As for poor Clothide, she was buried in Section 40 in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, New York, in an unmarked grave. The boys who asked the Ouija board the wrong questions. In 2007, teenage boys Joshua Tucker and Donald Schulchlin were messing with an Ouija board and asked if they should become serial killers. When the board replied yes, they asked who they should kill first, and the board replied Mom. Close friend Joshua and Donald had been out Christmas shopping looking for a gift for Donald's mother, but when they failed to find anything suitable, Joshua suggested they purchase an Ouija board. After the purchase, Joshua's behaviour changed drastically, and he told Donald that he had fantasized about raping and killing people. And after a heavy drinking session, the boys asked the Ouija board the question about becoming serial killers. Donald believed that during that session, Joshua had called forth the spirit of Satan and had become possessed. On December 20th, 2007, West Richland, Washington police received a 911 hang-up call from the Schulchens' home. When they arrived at the house, they found 15-year-old Donald and 16-year-old Joshua attempting to flee in a white truck. After apprehending the two boys, police entered the house and were confronted with a bloodbath. Just inside the front door lay the body of Donald's younger sister, 13-year-old Elizabeth. Joshua had sliced her throat while she was talking on the phone. In the back bedroom they found Donald's mother, Laurie. According to reports, Laurie had walked in as the boys attempted to clean up after murdering Elizabeth, and Joshua chased her, then stabbed her several times. When the knife broke, Donald handed Joshua a dumbbell and a meat cleaver to finish the job. Laurie was still alive when police found her, but later succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital. Joshua pleaded guilty to the murders and was ordered to spend the next 40 years behind bars. Donald, who prosecutors determined had been an accomplice to the crime but had not committed the murders himself, was offered a plea deal. In exchange for a guilty plea, he was sentenced to only 9.5 years, in spite of protests from his surviving family members. In the official court documents, Donald's claims of demonic possession were cited in the case, although these claims were never presented to a jury. Black eyes, no body. It all started when Ryan was around 5 years old, and he used to live in a village called Heswall in northwest UK. He was staying at his nan's house, which was only up the road from his home, but was particularly creepy, especially at night, as she lived on a dark lane with woods opposite. The house was quite old, and when his nan brought it back in the late 1950s, it still had a massive crack where a hole was patched up, after damage from a bomb during World War II. Ryan had stayed overnight at the house several times, but this particular night, he woke up in the early hours and went to the toilet. As he walked back to his room, he heard a noise from the bottom of the stairs. He curiously turned around and looked down the stairs. At first he saw something white, but then whatever it was came into full view, and it had a bright white face, a mouth, and the blackest eyes he'd ever seen, but strangely it had no body. Ryan was terrified and ran into his nan's room and hid under the covers. His nan asked what was wrong, and Ryan told her he had heard a noise. His nan went downstairs to investigate and came back and said it must have been something outside and it was nothing to worry about. After that night, Ryan refused to go upstairs in his nan's house alone, as he always felt like he was being watched. This manifested into him being petrified of looking up or down any stairs, and he often had someone with him just to attempt walking up or down them. As Ryan got older, he would sometimes be sitting on a bus or in school and would feel a hand press on his back, and he'd often find long random scratches appear on his body. The occurrences and fear of stairs lasted until he was around 13 years old, but at night he still felt uncomfortable with the feeling of being watched. Sadly, in 2009, Ryan's nan passed away from cancer at the age of 67, leaving Ryan and his family devastated. And in 2012, he and his family moved into his nan's old house. They lived there for 5 years, during which time Ryan never once looked down the stairs at night, for fear of seeing the face again. Ryan is now 23, and still has nightmares about the face, and as recently as 2 years ago, he would still get bright red scratches appear from nowhere on his arms. However, when he got married, and he and his wife had a baby daughter, the scratches stopped, and he now just has the occasional nightmare. although he is still petrified of wide open spaces and crowds when he is alone, as he gets the feeling he is being watched and hunted down. To this day, the face Ryan saw as a 5-year-old is vivid in his mind, and is the scariest thing he's ever seen, and those black as black eyes are still etched into his memory. Apart from his wife, Ryan hasn't shared this experience with anyone, as he found it so difficult to relive and thought people would think he was crazy, but assures us it was very real and would love to know if any of you have experienced anything similar. Strange anomaly on Ring camera. Deborah sent in this next footage. It is from her Ring camera that she had installed about a year ago. We do get sent quite a lot of Ring camera footage, mostly of orbs that are likely insects or cobwebs. But this footage is a little different. It doesn't appear to be your typical movement of flying bugs. Deborah has shown the footage to several people, and they have no plausible explanation for what was caught. Take a look. Pretty strange. Deborah is not aware that anyone died in the house before she moved in, or whether they experienced any strange anomalies, as she's never experienced anything inside the house. Deborah is a skeptic when it comes to anything paranormal, but is a little creeped out by what the camera has caught outside of her home. You will notice in the video a shooting star and a bat, but what the other floating mist is, we aren't sure. If any of you have any suggestions, let us know in the comments, as I'm sure Deborah will sleep easier if she has some answers. Who was Abby? This next photo was sent in by Stacy. It was taken about 20 years ago when her nephew was a baby. As soon as he could speak, he would talk about Abby, and one of his first words after Mama was Abby. No one in the family was called Abby, neither did they have any friends called Abby. As he grew up, he continually talked about his imaginary friend, and it wasn't uncommon to find him sitting on the floor laughing, talking, and playing with someone that wasn't there. He continued talking to Abby until he was around 8 years old, when he suddenly stopped mentioning her. When this photo was taken, a strange mist was visible above the baby. The family were puzzled, as there wasn't anyone smoking in the room, the temperature in the house was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no other reason for the mist to appear. They wonder if Abby had anything to do with it. Paranormal investigators are convinced that a swirling fog or ectomist is a sign of a spirit. They are mostly captured in graveyards and can be white, grey, or even black, and sometimes they appear before becoming a full-bodied apparition. Is this what was captured in the baby's photo? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Unexplained events. Stacy has 2 stories she wants to share. The first was in the house she grew up, that she believes is haunted. The house is the oldest standing brick house in a very small town and dates back to the 1840s, and the interior walls of the original structure are at least a foot thick. It wasn't only Stacy who experienced paranormal activity in her house, her brothers and cousins also did. They are all middle-aged adults now and rarely talk about the strange things that happened in the house, for fear that whatever was there will find them again. In fact, there were so many strange things that happened to Stacy and her family that she might eventually write a book about them. Stacy was very close to her great-grandmother until she had a stroke when Stacy was 14. After that, she was never the same, and when Stacy visited her in the care home, she had to be mentally prepared for her great-grandmother to think she was one of her long-dead cousins, and to pretend not to be creeped out when she talked to little children only she could see. One night, Stacy awoke to see her great-grandma standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She was very shocked and remembered saying, "Grandma, when did you get here?" Her grandma replied, "I am going now," and Stacy remembers saying, "Okay, have a good trip," and went back to sleep. At the time, she recalls feeling confused but comforted, as her grandma looked like her old self, not the emaciated shell she'd become since her stroke. The next day, Stacy asked her parents about the visit, assuming they had brought her home, but they kind of mocked her because it was so ridiculous. There was no way her great-grandmother could visit as she was too ill. Stacy was confused as she felt there was very much a man standing behind her great-grandmother and had assumed it was her dad helping her up the stairs. Later that day, Stacy found out that her grandmother had died the very night she had seen her. So was it all just a very vivid dream, or had her great-grandmother come to say goodbye? Stacy's next experience happened almost 25 years later, not in the same house, but this time at her parents' old farmhouse that was located so far in the country you couldn't even see neighbours. At the time, Stacy's dad and her brother were living there alone, and Stacy and her mum were visiting. Just as they were getting ready to leave at around 4 PM in the afternoon, they both headed to the bathroom because it was almost an hour drive back with nowhere to stop. Stacy came out to the bathroom and joined her mum in the entryway by the base of the stairs when they heard as clear as day the unmistakable sound of a little girl giggling. They looked at each other in shock and asked each other whether they heard it. Then both rushed out in a state of bewilderment. Stacy cannot explain what happened, but it felt like a little girl, maybe 6 years old, ran between her and her mum and was giggling as she ran up the stairs. The whole thing lasted around 6 seconds, but both Stacy and her mum got the feeling the little girl was pleased with herself for frightening them, as if she was playing a prank. It could not have been a living person, as they were the only two in the house, as the rest of the family were outside. Stacy cannot explain or dismiss what has happened to her over the years, but has her own thoughts. She likes to think of them as echoes, like when you turn off an old TV and an image remains on the screen, and that we are all powered by electrical impulses and energy that can neither be created or destroyed, only converted to other forms. Stacy is sure we will have the answers in the future, and the idea of her energy being converted and carried on comforts her. Stacy doesn't know how or why these things happened. All she knows is they did. Haunted London Bridge in Arizona. Back in 2007, Darren moved to Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and was surprised to find that one of its main attractions was the London Bridge. The bridge was originally built in 1830 and spanned the River Thames in London, England. However, by the 1960s, London was outgrowing the bridge, and it was decided a new London Bridge was needed. So in 1968, they sold the old one to Robert P. McCulloch, the founder of Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Robert dismantled the bridge and transported the exterior granite blocks to the United States for use in the construction of a new bridge. In Lake Havasu City, it took a few years to complete, but the bridge was rebuilt exactly as it was in London, and almost everything on the bridge is original, including the bricks, streetlights, railings, and name. However, along with the bricks and mortar, many believe the bridge brought with it the centuries of violence and death attracted to the streets of London, and it's thought to be haunted by several ghosts from London's gruesome past. The paranormal activity first started during its grand opening in 1971, when some onlookers witnessed a group of 4 women in Victorian dress walking along the bridge. Most thought it was a publicity stunt done by the city until the women mysteriously vanished into thin air. Another common occurrence on the bridge is apparitions wearing period clothing who disappear when you get too close. The most common sighting is the ghost of a woman in a black dress. She is usually seen walking quickly across the bridge, clutching her purse, and some have seen her jumping into the water at night, but disappear right before impact. Many have also felt a force of dark energy following them while crossing the bridge, or have heard unknown voices in their ear. It has such a reputation that numerous creepy films and TV shows have been filmed there, including the psychological thriller Olivia, the supernatural crime drama Bridge Across Time, about the murderous spirit of Jack the Ripper, and Ghost Adventures have done an episode there. With all that in mind, Darren, his ex-girlfriend, and another friend, who were really into ghost hunting at the time, decided to go to the bridge one night and take photos and voice recordings. When they listened back to one of the recordings, they were shocked to hear a whispering voice they didn't recognize. In the clip, you can hear Darren's girlfriend telling her friend where to take pictures and things to look for, while Darren was holding the voice recorder. You can also hear cars driving by, but listen carefully, there is another voice that didn't belong to any of them.
Try to get pictures of these down here. Try to get as many windows as you can. And more space where people could be walking or hiding or sitting. You can also take pictures of your fellow ghost hunters at work to show that we are actually trying, you know? Anyway, I'm really tired.
We have to agree, if that wasn't any of the three present, and Darren assures us it wasn't, then it's pretty creepy, especially with the history attached to the bridge. Darren thinks he can hear. How many times do I have to tell you? What can you hear? Time slip. This first creepy encounter was sent in by Logan from New York. In 2010, Logan worked at a nursing home in Somers, New York, that had a reputation for being a bit creepy, although until this incident, Logan had not personally experienced anything. However, that was all about to change. Logan checked in for a Thursday overnight shift. The procedure as a nurse's aide was to check allocated patients every 15 minutes. So Logan first checked in on a lady, who was, for the sake of this story, called Miss Johnson. He entered her room and everything was as it should be. Her usual posters and family pictures were all on the walls, and her usual medication was on the bedside table. Miss Johnson was laying on her back, sleeping, so Logan didn't disturb her. Nearing the end of his shift, Logan checked in on Miss Johnson for the last time, and was a little concerned as she was in the exact same position as before. So he alerted a nurse and asked her to take a look. The nurse stopped doing what she was doing and took off her glasses. She went quiet for a couple of minutes before saying, "Logan, Miss Johnson died last night." Slightly embarrassed, Logan went back to Miss Johnson's room to check and found it cleared out and cleaned, ready for the next patient. To this day, the thought of what happened scares Logan. He was close enough to Miss Johnson to be able to touch her face, but she wasn't even there. She had been moved after passing 24 hours earlier. Loch Lomond Catman. This story has been shared by one of our long-time subscribers who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call them D. D never thought they would be the sort of person who would send in a personal story, but after one of the most unnerving experiences in their life, felt compelled to contact us to see if our viewers could shed some light on what happened. D had just moved to Glasgow to complete their PhD, and a friend was visiting from Canada. Because D was new to the area, they thought it would be fun to check out the famous Highlands of Scotland. The pair took the train from Glasgow to Balloch, hoping to then jump on a local bus that would take them to Loch Lomond. When a bus for the village of Balmanna arrived, they hopped on and headed off. On the bus, Dee began feeling extremely nauseous, but dismissed it as a bit of travel sickness, as the roads were windy. As soon as they reached Balmaha, they went to the Oak Tree Inn where Dee vomited. After feeling a little better, the pair sat in the beer garden and ordered some food. As they sat waiting, a waitress came out with a single malt whiskey and started looking for the person who ordered it, stopping at each table to check whether someone with the surname Catman had ordered the drink, but strangely no one claimed it. With such a weird name, Dee and their friend laughed about Catman being a local urban legend, and that someone had ordered the drink under a fake name just to be spooky. After they'd eaten, they went on a hike through the dense forests on the foothills of Loch Lomond. This area is usually very busy with families, hikers and dog walkers, and as they headed up the trail, they met several people coming in the opposite direction with their dogs. However, all the dogs they encountered seemed agitated and nervous, and wouldn't stop barking. This in turn was unsettling their owners. There was also a man walking a bit behind with a German Shepherd-like dog. He appeared to be getting increasingly frustrated as his dog was refusing to move, and he was basically dragging it along. In the end, he gave up and turned around, leaving Dee and their friend alone on the trail. Although slightly unnerved that the once busy area was now quiet, the two kept walking up the foothills. The brush was really dense, and while there was the usual rustling and chirping of the forest sounds, there was also a weird, unsettling noise that sounded like sniggering or hissing. However, it didn't sound human. The pair were pretty freaked out by this stage, but kept walking to try and find a good lookout spot to see the loch. Suddenly Dee's friend pointed into the dense woods, and for a split second, they both saw a hunched-over man wearing a stovepipe hat. All of a sudden, the figure turned around and stared right at them, His hands were extremely hairy, and he held them in front of his chest like claws. His face was bewhiskered. Quickly, Dee's friend turned on their phone light, and when the light hit the man's eyes, they glowed like a cat's. Terrified, the two friends ran, and for the rest of the day, all they could think and talk about was how scared they both were, and whether what they witnessed was anything to do with the Catman who ordered the drink earlier. Dee asked us to do some research on the area to see if anyone has experienced anything similar. The nearest we could find was the Catman of Greenock, a town about 35 miles from Loch Lomond. Legend says that the Catman of Greenock is a man with dark skin who is usually spotted at night, hiding in bushes and under vehicles. He supposedly has glowing eyes and eats rats with his bare hands. He is thought to be a Russian sailor who abandoned his ship in the 1970s and started living on the streets of Greenock. He earned the name Catman due to rumours that he lived with a group of wild cats and started mimicking their behaviours. Could it be that Dee's sighting and the Catman of Greenock are one and the same? What do you think? Deceased uncle making contact. Paul lives in New Zealand now, but grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland. When he was 16, Paul lived with his family in a 2-bedroom flat in Edinburgh. Because the house was so small, Paul shared a bedroom with his uncle. However, sadly his uncle had a massive heart attack and died in the home. Almost immediately after his death, Paul started hearing what sounded like someone walking around his room at night, and things started moving around the house. Paul's parents were pretty dismissive at first, putting it down to grief and an overactive teenage imagination. Paul often had friends over and told them how his bedroom door would open by itself, and on a few occasions his friends also witnessed it. Paul's mum also started to have strange things happen that couldn't be easily explained, and when his sister came to stay just after having a baby, during the night when getting up to feed the baby, she'd hear footsteps walking down the hall. She'd look, expecting to see her mum or brother, but no one was there, they were all asleep. On another occasion a few years after his uncle's death, Paul was in the house on his own and was laying in the bath when there were 3 loud knocks on the bathroom door. By now, Paul had got used to the strange anomalies and was no longer freaked out by them because he felt it was just his uncle contacting him from the afterlife to let him know that he was still around. We know this is quite a common thing after someone close has passed, and we'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. The Men in Black. Amber is one of our valued patrons, and she sent this story in about her mum. It's only short, but extremely creepy. When Amber's mum was a child, she regularly had visions of 4 men dressed in suits and black hats, all walking up the stairs together at her mum and dad's house. She was terrified of them, and always too scared to be left alone. When Amber was about 10, her mum's parents and now Amber's nan and granddad still lived in the same house. But in around 2006, her granddad became seriously ill with cancer, and the family took care of him in the house during his last days. After he passed away, the family called the undertakers, and when they arrived, Amber's mum showed them up the stairs to where her dad was. As she neared the top, she saw the 4 men from her childhood, dressed in suits and all wearing black hats. Premonitions like this are incredibly common and creepy, and we'd love to know if you've ever had any similar premonitions to Amber's. Landline from the other side. Isaiah shared this next story with us from the early days of his 911 telecommunications career. Isaiah's first apartment kept 911 and dispatch operations in the basement of the sheriff's office, which later had a jail added. The building itself was very old and had a few ghost stories of its own, but the story he remembers most vividly is this one. Isaiah was working overnight with an older co-worker. She was due to leave at midnight, and he would be staying alone until 8 AM to monitor officers and any emergencies. Around 11 PM, a call came in on the 911 line. Isaiah's co-worker picked it up and afterwards relayed the call to him. She told him that after asking the usual questions about the address and nature of the emergency, the female caller went silent, but after a long pause said in a quiet voice, "Hello." The co-worker then asked if she was okay. Was there an emergency? The woman hesitated again before replying, "Yes, I think there is." She was then asked, "Can you tell me what's happening? Do you need an ambulance?" There was another silence before the caller spoke again in a confused voice. Yes, I think I do. The co-worker continues to ask what's wrong, but the lady doesn't answer again. So assuming the caller may have fainted or passed out, the co-worker sends an ambulance to the location. Luckily, because the call was from a landline, the address was automatically assigned. The 911 terminal showed it as a local nursing home, and the specific landline was assigned to a particular room number. Initially, a police officer is sent out to assess the situation. However, about 15 minutes later, the officer calls in on the radio and advises Isaiah to cancel the ambulance. It is not needed. Isaiah and his co-worker are confused, but do as he asks. A few moments later, the officer called in again on the landline. Isaiah picks up the call, and the first thing the officer says is that if we receive another call from that room, to send his sergeant, as he will not be going back. It is worth noting, it is extremely unusual for any officer to refuse to attend a call. When Isaiah asked what happened, he said he spoke with the charge nurse at the nursing home, and she informed him the female resident in that specific room had passed away the day before, and no one had been in to clean it out, and no one had access to that landline during the night. When Isaiah relayed the information to the colleague who took the initial call, she was freaked out to say the least. The following day, Isaiah listened to the call himself. He remembered the crackle of static on the line, unusual for landlines, and the way the woman spoke, almost confused, like she knew something was wrong, but she couldn't really pin down what it was. But most of all, it was the look on his co-worker's face. She knew she spoke with someone in that room. The woman on the line was real, but the officer was telling us she wasn't. In fact, she might even have been dead. Isaiah has never forgotten that shift and his co-worker's fear at her brush with the unknown. Hand of Horror. The last story we'll talk about was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call her A. A's story happened when she was 9 or 10 years old while visiting a relative in Middleburg, Florida, near the Jacksonville area. A was asleep in bed when she suddenly woke in the middle of the night. She wasn't sure if the noises woke her up, or if they started shortly after she woke up, but she could hear something heavily shuffling across the carpet. The door to the master bedroom was open, and she could just see across the hall to where her adult relatives were asleep and completely still. A's 2 brothers were also asleep in their rooms. The noise lasted what felt like forever, but A continued laying in her bed until it got so loud she pulled the covers over her head and eventually it stopped. After a few minutes, A mustered up the courage to look from under the sheets, and to her horror, she could see across the hall that something was attached to the lower leg of her sleeping relative. It looked like a large black hairy hand with long pointy sharp nails. It appeared as if someone or something was crouched next to the foot of the bed, and the hand was coming from the floor. It's worth noting that A has told us that she has lucid dreams, sleep paralysis, and even night terrors on rare occasions, but this was not one of these times. She was fully aware she was awake, could move, but had no control over what she was witnessing. The next morning, A talked about the incident with the relative, who dismissed it as just a dream, or that she had just heard him rubbing his foot against the sheets. But A knew what she saw and heard, and it wasn't that. A has never been able to explain what happened that night, but one thing she is sure of is it did happen. After the incident, A did a bit of research, and the closest thing she could get was a skunk ape, although there was no foul stench, so doesn't believe it was that. If any of you have experienced anything similar, I'm sure A would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Grey Lady of Cumber Park. Cumber Park in Nottinghamshire has long had the reputation of being haunted by a grey lady who walks slowly and disappears into the mist as strangers approach. The National Trust-owned park is very popular with dog walkers, and when Hannah and Dave Rowett were walking their Labradors in the park early one morning in December 2022, they got the feeling they were not alone. Hannah spotted something in front of her, quickly pulled out her phone, and captured a scary white silhouette crossing her path as she followed it with a torch. Take a look. After Hannah posted it to her Facebook page, it racked up hundreds of views and comments. Hannah claimed there was no logical explanation for what she captured, and even her skeptic partner Dave was stunned.
Could that have been the Grey Lady that supposedly haunts the woodland, or is there another explanation? Let us know below. Chop Chop House in Boise, Idaho. 805 West Linden Street in Boise, Idaho is known to locals as Chop Chop House for a very good reason. The craftsman-style home was the location of a gruesome murder more than 3 decades ago. In the early morning hours of June 30th, 1987, 37-year-old Daniel Rogers and 31-year-old Darren Cox shot and killed 21-year-old Preston Murr in the basement of the Boise house that at the time was owned by Rogers. The two men then used an axe and knife to dismember Murr's corpse. They then wrapped the body parts in plastic bags and drove to the Idaho-Oregon border to dump them in the Brownlee Reservoir. However, it seems that Murr's horrifying death could have been avoided. Investigations revealed that after an altercation broke out between the 3 men, Murr was shot in the shoulder, but he managed to flee the scene and ran to a nearby house, frantically banging on the door begging for help. The person inside didn't answer the door, but they did call the police and told them about the pounding on the door, and that they could hear someone shouting, "Let go of me," followed by anguished screams. The police never responded to the call. The following day, the neighbor called again after finding blood on his screen door. When police finally arrived, they found blood throughout the neighborhood, on sidewalks and at least one other neighboring house, as Paul Murs desperately tried to seek help and escape his attackers. Rogers and Cox were eventually jailed for their parts in the slaying, but since that night, a dark legacy lingers around 805 W Linden Street. Today the house is rented out to students seeking off-campus housing, but rumours persist about what goes on in the house that many describe as having a distinctly off feel about it. One persistent rumour is that blood has been witnessed dripping down the walls of the basement. The basement is where all the paranormal activity is felt, with stories of being watched and a general unsettling feeling. But perhaps the creepiest experience happened to student Dan and his friends who had rented the house. One night they thought they'd heard someone trying to break into the house. No one was there when they went to the front porch to check things out, but after looking around the front yard, Dan turned to face the house and saw a big black oily looking thing in the window of an upstairs bedroom. He remembers the shadowy figure moving back from the window and towards the bedroom door before it disappeared. Shortly after, it reappeared outside in a mirror on the porch. Dan watched as the ball of oily blackness moved down the large column of the porch, slowly growing in size until it took up the full reflection of the mirror and moved right through him. The vivid and unsettling experience has given the house such a bad reputation that many avoid it, believing the oily blob is the desperate spirit of Preston Murr, still trying to escape his assailants. Last sight of a departed friend. This next true paranormal experience happened to Margaret S. Gladstone from Wiltshire, England, who wrote to Country Life magazine on September 24, 1948. Margaret was prompted to write by some recent letters which had appeared in the magazine in previous weeks. Margaret recalled returning to her flat in Westminster, London, one afternoon when she saw 2 friends coming towards her on the other side of the street. She was in a rush and running late, and although they were dear friends, she had no time to stop and hoped they would not notice her. Margaret deliberately crossed the street, walking behind them, and successfully avoided their gaze. At breakfast time the next day, a mutual friend rang to tell Margaret that the man she had seen the day before had passed away in the night. Margaret was shocked and told the friend that she had seen him and his wife the day before, and they appeared in full health. Her friend then exclaimed that this was an impossibility, as he had been ill for some days and had been bedbound. So was he trying to say a last goodbye, or was it a case of mistaken identity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever experienced something like this. Lizzie Borden House. Most people know the story of Lizzie Borden, the daughter who on August 4th, 1893, allegedly brutally murdered both her parents in their home in Fall Rivers, Massachusetts. Andrew and his wife Abby Borden were found slaughtered in their home. Although murder wasn't uncommon in the late 1800s,
The severity of their injuries inflicted by an axe shocked the locals, and soon their 32-year-old daughter Lizzie became the main suspect. The crime and trial made headlines around the world. However, Lizzie was eventually acquitted of murder, but she remains forever linked to the heinous killings, as does the home where they were committed. Nowadays, the house is a bed and breakfast and attracts visitors from around the world who are drawn by morbid curiosity and want to see for themselves if the place lives up to its reputation of being haunted. One of the tour guides at the house tells how when she started working there, she was skeptic and didn't believe in the paranormal. That was until she started experiencing a few strange things herself. Guests had long reported that they could hear laughing and playing in the middle of the night and things moving around. The guide didn't believe them until she found toys scattered around a room no one had been in and witnessed a picture fall over and slide in front of her without a plausible explanation, and a closet door open on its own. Also, on the eve of the anniversary of Andrew and Abby's murder, she and 2 other tour guides felt sudden sharp piercing pains in their left eye, in the exact location of Andrew Borden's fatal injuries. But perhaps the creepiest thing of all happened when the guide asked a tour group to turn their cell phones to silent before starting a tour. Moments later, a guest's cell phone started ringing. The female guest looked up and said, "It's my mum." The tour guide asked if she wanted to leave and take the call, to which the woman replied, "She died 2 years ago." Who's that girl? In 2022, brothers Christian and Gabriel Ashmore took a selfie of themselves inside a tower of tires. However, after looking more closely at one of the images, they realized they were not alone in the stack, because looking over their shoulder was the ghostly image of a young girl they didn't recognize. Christian told his mum and showed her the photo, and initially she thought the boys had messed with the image, using some kind of ghost app, so she did a couple of checks to see if she could change the lighting, or see whether the photo had been altered in any way, but couldn't find any evidence of this, and believed her boys didn't have the skills to change the photo anyway, and they were adamant they had not edited it in any way. In fact, Christian was apparently left so terrified by the ghost girl that he refused to go to bed alone and stayed in his mum's room. After sharing the photo with family and friends on Facebook, many believed the boys had captured the spirit of a deceased child who just wanted to play, whilst others were more skeptical, believing the photo is tampered with. What do you think? When the ghost you're hunting hunts you. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, is best known as the location of the Shawshank Redemption movie. However, it also boasts a rather unpleasant history. It was originally built in 1896 for boys who were too old for juvenile detention but hadn't committed crimes warranting prison. Although eventually it was converted into a maximum security prison. By the 1980s, conditions had become wretched, and it was a horrible place with a vein of violence that ran right through the building. It was the scene of several suicides, murders and riots, and eventually it was closed in 1990. With its history of misery and death, it is no surprise that the building is haunted not only by former inmates and employees, but by anyone associated with them, including women. One is the tormented soul of the wife of a former warden who was shot with a gun sitting on top of a box that she was pulling down from a closet shelf. The anguished woman is often heard crying, and her rose-smelling perfume wafts in one of the bedrooms. Another spirit is a woman who sits in the prison chapel and cries, but when she is approached, she disappears. Other people have witnessed her walking around the chapel. Then there's the malevolent presence in one of the prison's solitary confinement cells, an angry spirit who wards off ghost hunters and visitors, warning them not to enter his cell. He has been caught on tape swearing. The former prisoner has also been known to follow people home, and one ghost hunter and her partner had a terrifying experience when he latched on to one of them. One day, one of them saw him through a reflection in the window, a shadow figure she knew was him. In fact, the spirit continued to follow her until things got so bad, an expert had to be called in to rid her of the ghost. A scary tale of when ghost hunting can go wrong, and the reality of what happens when you go looking for the wrong things. So that's it for this video. We hope you enjoyed, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. We'd also love to hear if you've had any of your own stories or experiences with the paranormal lately. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.